Having served variously as a mark of virility, servility, and gentility, circumcision has, throughout the centuries, worn many symbolic hats. While anthropologists disagree as to the definitive origins of circumcision, the earliest hard evidence comes from the first ancient Egyptian mummies of considerable vintage, around 2300 BC. That being said, Egyptian paintings date circumcision to centuries prior, depicting ritual circumcision as prerequisite to entering the priesthood. Contention remains as to whether circumcision was a sign of pride rather than prejudice among the ancient Egyptian world. While popular among the elite, forced circumcision was inflicted on captured Phoenician and Jewish slaves as a badge of dishonor, more practical or rather less lethal than castration. Whatever its initial origins, by 1800 BC, the Jews were practicing circumcision for religious reasons in deference to God's religious injunction to Abraham as contained in the Torah. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Genesis 17:10-11. Though the religious reasons have remained ostensibly the same for thousands of years, the procedure has changed rather sharply. The original practice, milah, was abbreviated to only the removal of the tip of the foreskin. The decision to snip beyond the tip lay in the cultural collision between Greco-Roman and Jewish cultures. While the Jews considered circumcision among matters theistic, the Greeks regarded it as an aesthetic faux pas. As Hellenic culture became the fashion throughout the Roman Empire, Jews seeking to avoid discrimination and compete in Roman games sought to emulate their hosts by stretching the foreskin and tying it closed. If this stretching is done long and regularly enough over time, the skin will grow to accommodate the missing bit. However, Jewish elders, rather unsympathetic to the when in Rome justification of the blasphemous procedure, they instated the Brit Periar around 140 AD. With this, the circumcision procedure now included removing the foreskin to beyond the ridge of the glans, ensuring all Jews would be fully shorn of Roman identity. With circumcision having assumed a distinctly Jewish connotation, it became grounds for anti-Semitic discrimination. History is littered with examples such as the Seleucid king Antiochus occupying Jerusalem in 169 BC, who made the Brit Periar punishable by death. The Roman author Suetonius records court proceedings wherein a 90-year-old man suspected of evading the fiscus Judaicus, or Jewish tax, was stripped naked for what must have been the Roman take on strict scrutiny. After 50 BC, circumcision remained, at least popularly speaking, a largely Jewish affair until controversy ignited among early Christians. It was yet unclear whether the gospel required circumcision among converts, which would thus restrict Christianity to Jews or Gentiles willing to undergo the procedure. Given this might have nipped the spread of Christianity in the bud, at least among adult males, it was decided that circumcision was not prerequisite to conversion, and the Catholic Church maintained a degree of hostility towards the practice which would set the tone for circumcision until the 19th century. The Greco-Roman aversion towards circumcision, once heavily salted with anti-Semitism, persisted long after unruly Gauls had overrun the empire. Indeed, by the time Britain had matured to imperial status, explorers who had been busily exporting British commerce and colonialism returns with salacious tales about the barbaric tribes that lay at the extremities of the empire and the varieties of circumcision practiced within. Sir Richard Burton wrote of one such procedure that tears off the epidermis from the cuts around the groin and flays the testicles and penis, ending with amputation of the foreskin. Certain Islamic people, such as those of the Mughal Empire, introduced the British to circumcision in a rather more unceremonious fashion, claiming the foreskins of vanquished British troops willy-nilly on the battlefield. Despite the initial close shaves between the British and other cultures, they eventually spearheaded a change in attitude about circumcision. Partially inspired by a sense of cultural cosmopolitanism or fear of troops losing their heads under threat of battlefield circumcision, the British began a revival of circumcision. The social and hygienic virtues of circumcision were well entrenched during the Victorian era, with British royalty beginning a practice of circumcising their heirs, the peerage following suit, and the change in attitudes radiating downwards through British society and empire. This is not to say that the religious element of circumcision subsided. Indeed, one reason for the surge in circumcision in some regions was precisely to make it slightly more difficult, or more aptly uncomfortable, to commit the alleged sin of masturbation than if one's foreskin was fully intact. Further, during both World Wars, the political and racial subtext of circumcision re-emerged with bloody consequence. Forced circumcision accompanied the massacre of Armenians under the Ottoman Empire, while circumcision served again as a potentially lethal marker of Jewish identity under Nazi Germany. In the present day, however, racial and class controversies regarding circumcision have cooled. Nonetheless, the demographic pattern and medical consensus regarding circumcision have remained far from settled. The size of the circumcised British population has dropped precipitously from 30% at its heyday to roughly 4% today. The United States has remained steady, with well over half of the male population being circumcised, and Israel has, unsurprisingly, become the circumcision capital of the world, with nearly a 100% circumcision rate. Even within largely circumcised populations, health debates rage. Critics of circumcision cite an absence of evidence vis-a-vis the supposed health benefits of circumcision and list a litany of disadvantages, such as pain to the child, infection, urinary complications, enhanced risk of disease, and in extremely rare cases, even death from complications due to the circumcision. 1 in 500,000, or about 8 babies per year in the United States, dying as a result of the procedure. Defenders of the practice, however, claim that the health benefits outweigh the risks to the minority. They cite greater immunity from certain sexually transmitted diseases and genital cancer, as well as the supposed avoidance of certain general hygiene problems, though the latter is a bit of a stretch. These debates have been exacerbated by religious and anti-religious camps among the medical community, with the surgical soundness of some procedures, such as the rarely practiced today Orthodox Judaic tradition of sucking to stem the bleeding, being called into question. To compound the issue, men do not have a monopoly as beneficiaries or victims of this surgical procedure. Female circumcision, or female genital mutilation, FGM, which involves partial or complete removal of the external female genitalia, has been around for centuries. Again, Egypt features as the setting for this operation, with the Greek geographer Strabo, who visited around 25 BC, corroborating the records as well as writings of other observers. However, physical evidence is lacking, so the actual origin remains a mystery. One medical historian concedes there is no way of knowing, as the ritual was widespread across many cultures, from Australian Aborigine tribes to various African societies. Like many who support male circumcision, cultural, religious, mythical, medical, and even aesthetic motives are offered as justification. So devoted are some advocates of female circumcision that in 1930 the future Kenyan Prime Minister explained that the procedure was integral to the survival of Kenya's ethnic institution. Later, in the mid-1950s, when clitoridectomy was banned, young Kenyan girls even colluded with friends to perform the procedure on each other. Despite FGM advocates, the practice grew to be viewed by its detractors as barbaric, and the outcry against it has been gaining steam since the 1960s. While the debate over the health benefits of male circumcision has kept it in the good graces of some medical institutions, the World Health Organization has denounced FGM as having no health benefit, and the United Nations passed a resolution encouraging countries to abandon the practice. Bans have been implemented in several African and Western countries like Kenya 2001, Egypt 2007, Sweden 1982, the United Kingdom 1987, and the United States in 1992. Despite the cut and thrust of circumcision politics, male circumcision will almost certainly remain a point of pride and tradition, primarily for religious reasons, but also on a much lesser scale for aesthetic reasons, a viewpoint poignantly represented by the character of Elaine on Seinfeld, when she said of seeing an uncircumcised penis, "It has no face, no personality, it was like a Martian." Today, male circumcision still remains overwhelmingly popular in Israel, as well as in the Middle East and North African countries, where it seems to have originated, but in Western countries, the procedure is declining rapidly. As to female circumcision, remarkably, the data indicates that it is on the rise among the immigrant population in the West. And now for a bonus fact. Speaking of the anti-masturbation crowd among certain religious groups, despite famed priest Martin Luther himself once stating, "Nature never lets up, to say it crudely, but honestly, if it doesn't go into a woman, it goes into your shirt." The Christian Church, among others, took an extra hard stance against masturbation for a while there. Not one to play it politically correct, Mark Twain was happy to make light of public sentiment on this topic in a lecture he gave to the Stomach Club in 1879 called Some Thoughts on the Science of Onanism. If you're wondering, Onan was the guy from the Old Testament who was killed for spilling his seed on the ground instead of in the lady. While this is often pointed to as definitive proof the Bible is saying no to masturbation, with the support here being that it wastes sperm, sperm because, there's an incredibly limited supply, anyone who actually bothers to read the whole story would see that the issue doesn't appear to have been that, but more that he was supposed to be knocking up his deceased brother's widow. He did go ahead and have sex with her, but then he pulled out so his brother would have no male heir, and thus Onan himself would be entitled to a greater inheritance. Naturally, this didn't go over well, given he was disobeying his father's direct order. Strike 1, didn't do his brotherly duty to help his brother's line live on. Strike 2, and finally, rather than just refusing outright, he went ahead and had sex, but didn't give the lady the baby juice, and that would be strike 3. And then, of course, you can tack on that he was being greedy to boot. In any event, Twain began his speech on onanism by referring to the act as a species of recreation to which I perceive you are much addicted. He goes on, Homer in the second book of the Iliad says with fine enthusiasm, give me masturbation or give me death. Caesar in his commentary says, to the lonely it is company, to the forsaken it is a friend, to the aged and to the impotent it is a benefactor. They that are penniless are yet rich in that they still have this majestic diversion. In another place, this experienced observer has said, there are times when I prefer it to sodomy. Robinson Crusoe says, I cannot describe what I owe to this gentle art. Queen Elizabeth said, it is the bulwark of virginity. Cetewayo, the Zulu hero, remarked, a jerk in the hand is worth two in the bush. The immortal Franklin has said, masturbation is the best policy. Michelangelo said to Pope Julius II, self-negation is noble, self-culture beneficent, self-possession is manly, but to the truly great and inspiring soul they are poor and tame compared with self-abuse. Obviously a fan, Twain remained faithful to his journalistic roots and gave equal time to those who were not enamored with the ancient art, noting, Brigham Young, an expert of incontestable authority, said, as compared with the other thing, it is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. Solomon said, there is nothing to recommend it but its cheapness. Galen said, it is shameful to degrade to such bestial uses that grand limb, that formidable member, which we votaries of science dub the major maxillary, when they dub it at all, which is seldom. It would be better to amputate the os frontis than to put it to such use. Twain then turned to Darwin and the noble monkey, stating, Mr. Darwin was grieved to feel obliged to give up his theory that the monkey was the connecting link between man and the lower animals. I think he was too hasty. The monkey is the only animal, except man, that practices this science. Hence, he is our brother. There is a bond of sympathy and relationship between us. Give this ingenious animal an audience of the proper kind, and he will straightway put aside his other affairs and take a whet, and you will see by his contortions and his ecstatic expression that he takes an intelligent and human interest in his performance. Like a modern roast today, Twain couldn't resist sticking it to his audience a bit as he opined that those who indulge in the recreation too much can be easily detected by their disposition to eat, to drink, to smoke, to meet together convivially, to laugh, to joke, and tell idyllic stories. Ultimately, however, Twain explained that this science was the least efficacious of all sexual acts, since as an amusement it is too fleeting, as an occupation too wearing. As a public exhibition, there is no money in it. It is unsuited to the drawing room, and in the most cultured society, it has long been banished. It has, at last, in our day of progress and improvement, been degraded to brotherhood with flatulence. Among the best bred, these two arts are now indulged in only private, though by consent of the whole company, when only males are present, it is still permissible, in good society, to remove the embargo on the fundamental sign. Finally, Twain concluded with these maxims. If you must gamble your life sexually, don't play a lone hand too much. When you feel a revolutionary uprising in your system, get your Vendome column down some other way. Don't jack it down. In today's world of high-tech medicine, it's easy to take for granted the ease, regularity, and relative safety with which modern surgery is performed. For most of human history, surgery was a bloody, painful, and dangerous affair. Without the benefit of antiseptic techniques or anesthesia, surgeons had to work fast, racing against the clock to amputate a limb or excise a tumor before their patient bled out on the operating table. And even if a patient survived the procedure, this was no guarantee of success, with the vast majority succumbing within days to infection or other post-operative complications. But with advances in medical science, surgery became progressively safer and more effective, and today procedures that would have seemed unthinkable just a few decades before, like heart transplants and major brain surgeries, are performed by the thousands every year. But as with most scientific advances, this revolution in surgery came with its fair share of quackery and abuses, and in the early 20th century, the medical profession was swept by a bizarre and disturbing fad as surgeons, drunk on their newfound operating abilities, began relieving patients of all manner of perfectly healthy organs, from teeth to tonsils to their entire colons, in a fanatical quest to rid humanity of disease once and for all. This fad for preventatively excising healthy organs had its origins in one of humanity's oldest medical obsessions, constipation. In 1914, Russian biologist Ilya Mechnikov, winner of the 1908 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his pioneering work in immunology, developed a theory of chronic disease, which he dubbed auto-intoxication. According to Mechnikov, the colon, the 4.5-foot length of large intestine connecting the small intestine to the rectum, was little more than a festering cesspool where bodily wastes accumulated, stagnated, and putrefied. Based on the observation that injecting feces into rats and mice inevitably resulted in death, Mechnikov concluded that the same process was taking place in the colon, and that the longer waste stagnated and putrefied in the gut, the more toxins leached through the intestinal wall into the body. Mechnikov attributed a whole host of chronic ailments to these toxins, including ulcers, bladder cancer, hypertension, rheumatoid arthritis, and even psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia and depression. He further theorized that old waste adhered to the intestinal wall and hardened, preventing the absorption of vital nutrients. In short, almost every disease under the sun could in some way be linked to chronic constipation. While Mechnikov was among the first to frame this theory in modern scientific terms, the idea that waste piling up in the intestines is the root of chronic disease is actually a very old one, first appearing in the Shushrata Samhita, an ancient Sanskrit medical text written around 1000 BCE. In addition to listing the various afflictions allegedly caused by chronic constipation, the text also prescribes a variety of purgatives and cleansing enemas for treating the underlying condition. The use of purgatives and enemas to treat disease gained further popularity in ancient Greece with the development of the four humours theory of medicine, which held that the human body was governed by four fundamental fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. An imbalance in these humours was thought to be at the root of all diseases, which could be cured by restoring the balance. For an example, an excess of blood could be relieved by bloodletting, and for more on this, please do check out our previous video, What's Up with the Increasingly Popular Modern Practice of Medical Leeches. Constipation was thought to be caused by a buildup of black bile leading to melancholy or depression, and once again the prescribed treatments were mainly oral purgatives and enemas, also known as clysters, after an ancient Greek word meaning to wash out. Clysters remained a popular cure-all for nearly 2 millennia, reaching the peak of their popularity during the reign of the French Sun King Louis XIV. To the fashionable 17th century French nobleman, keeping a clean colon was as vital to a healthy lifestyle as regular exercise, good diet, and vitamin supplements are to us today. Enemas, up to 4 a day, were administered by specialized doctors, known as something in French that I can't possibly attempt to pronounce, but in English basically mean backside lemonade applicators, and this was done either at home or in special facilities known as restaurants, from the French meaning to restore or to rejuvenate. Only later did this term come to refer to establishments which serve food. Depending on the size of his pocketbook, the discerning nobleman could choose from a bewildering variety of enema options, from nozzles made of tortoise shell, mother of pearl, and even gold, to cleansing mixtures containing ingredients such as orange blossom, angelica, thyme, rosemary, bergamot, and damask rose, each of which was claimed to have its own specific therapeutic properties. Certain popular concoctions even contained coffee and tobacco, producing an immediate rejuvenating rush and, in certain cases, long-term addiction. At first, tobacco was infused and administered in liquid form, but the development of the rectal smoking pipe allowed tobacco smoke to be blown directly into the rectum. Tobacco enemas were later developed into a method for resuscitating drowning victims, and in the 18th century, special kits were installed along the River Thames for this purpose. And for more on this, please check out our previous video when doctors literally blew smoke up your ass. So indispensable were enemas to 17th century French society that not even criminals in prisons were denied their daily cleansing. And when it came to maintaining the health of the king, there was no such thing as too many enemas. When the Sun King's father, Louis XIII, fell gravely ill in 1643, over the course of 6 months his doctors administered no less than 47 bloodlettings, 215 oral purgatives, and 312 enemas, 2 per day, except on holidays. Louis XIV was equally indulgent, subjecting himself to 38 bloodlettings, hundreds of enemas, and thousands of oral purgatives in order to sustain his legendary gluttony. This mania for enemas attracted the mockery of contemporary commentators such as the English writer Jonathan Swift and playwright Molière, who parodied the practice in his 1673 production La Malade Imaginaire, or The Hypochondriac. Ironically, Molière suffered a brain hemorrhage while playing the lead role on stage and found himself at the mercy of the very doctors he had so thoroughly skewered. Unsurprisingly, their swift intervention with bleedings, purgatives, and enemas proved ineffective, and the great playwright died later that day. While the mania for enemas never again reached the absurd heights of the 17th century, the medical obsession with constipation never really went away, with laxatives and purgatives remaining the best-selling pharmaceuticals for over 300 years. And while the four humors eventually gave way to more modern medical paradigms like germ theory, ironically this did little to quell anxieties about bowel regularity and auto-intoxication. Following the publication of Charles Darwin's seminal 1859 work on the origin of species by means of natural selection, anatomists began to realize that the human body was not in fact a perfect creation made in God's image, but a messy and imperfect machine containing all manner of vestigial features left over from its evolutionary past. This ranged from the tailbone and appendix to the uvula and the tonsils. In these seemingly leftover and useless organs, doctors began to see the roots of all human disease, and no single organ attracted more scrutiny and scorn than did that old enemy, the colon. Thanks to theorists like Ilya Mechnikov and health guru John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the inventor of cornflakes, the colon came to be seen as a venomous snake coiled up in the abdomen of every person, slowly poisoning them and robbing them of a long and healthy life. But while surgeons may have long dreamed of excising this troublesome organ altogether, it was not until the development of antiseptic treatments and anesthesia in the late 19th century that such a procedure became a viable reality. And when it did, surgeons jumped on it with fanatical zeal, and none more so than Dr. William Arbuthnot Lane. The celebrated chief of surgery at Guy's Hospital in London, Lane was a surgical powerhouse, pioneering techniques for setting of fractures with metal plates and screws, repairing hair lips and cleft palates, clearing intestinal obstructions, and reducing post-operative infection through the use of specially designed sterile instruments. Such were his eccentricities and prodigious powers of deduction that he is believed to be one of the real-life inspirations for the character of Sherlock Holmes. In the early 20th century, Lane directed his considerable talents and energies towards a new enemy, the dreaded colon. At first, the good doctor recommended that his patients consume large quantities of heavy cream and liquid paraffin to purge their colons of harmful, putrefying bacteria. But for Lane, this was merely a stopgap measure. He soon developed the procedure that would make him infamous, the radical colonectomy, in which the entire colon is excised and the end of the small intestine attached directly to the rectum. In this manner, Lane claimed waste would be expelled as soon as its nutrients were absorbed, giving it no time to build up in the colon and putrefy. The radical colectomy caused a sensation, with patients flocking in their hundreds to Lane's surgery to undergo the new cutting-edge procedure. From the 1910s to the 1930s, thousands of Britons and Americans had their perfectly healthy colons snipped out as a preventative measure, with Lane himself performing over 1,000 such procedures over the course of his career. The mania for colectomies reached such heights that the procedure was regularly prescribed for ailments as minor as a sore throat or a stomach ulcer. On one occasion, a young boy who scheduled for tonsillectomy was accidentally wheeled into Lane's surgery and emerged without his colon, but his tonsils were intact. The colectomy craze was parodied in George Bernard Shaw's 1906 play The Doctor's Dilemma, in which the character, Dr. Cutler Walpole, clearly modelled on Lane, exhorts the medical wisdom of the day. 95% of the human race suffer from chronic blood poisoning and die of it. It's as simple as ABC. Your unformed sac is full of decaying matter, undigested food and waste products, rank to mains. Now you take my advice, Ridgeon. Let me cut it out for you. You'll be another man afterwards. But despite the medical miracles promised by the radical colectomy, such as delaying the onset of aging and warding off depression, the actual results of Lane's procedure were predictably disappointing. Few colectomy patients experienced the promised benefits of the procedure, and while Lane was a far better surgeon than most, up to 30% of his patients later died of infections and other post-operative complications. Gradually, medical opinion began to turn against the radical colectomy, though the procedure continued to be regularly performed as late as the 1930s. Lane would later abandon his faith in surgical intervention and instead found a movement known as New Health, which prompted more radical, holistic lifestyle choices such as fresh air, whole foods, fruits and vegetables, exercise, and vitamin supplements as a path to good health and longevity. But Lane was hardly alone in his advocacy of surgical intervention, and even his considerable zeal was far surpassed by one of his contemporaries, Dr. Henry Andrews Cotton. In 1907, Cotton became the superintendent of the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum in Trenton, New Jersey, and immediately imposed a series of progressive reforms, including eliminating physical restraints, hiring social workers, and organizing daily staff meetings to coordinate patient care. However, around 1915, Cotton learned of a new theory proposed by Johns Hopkins psychiatrist Dr. Adolph Meyer, which held that all mental illness was caused by latent bacterial infections. Like putrefying food in the colon, Meyer argued, these hidden infections produce toxins that slowly poison the mind. Well, this idea, which Meyer called the theory of focal infection, was based on two key pieces of evidence. First, the observation that those with severe bacterial infections often became delirious, and second, the discovery in 1913 that Treponema pallidum, the bacterium that causes syphilis, was also responsible for a form of dementia known as the general paresis of the insane. And for more on this, please see our previous video. That time a dude was given a Nobel Prize for intentionally infecting people with malaria. To Dr. Cotton, the upshot of Meyer's theory was simple. Eliminate all sites of infection and mental illness could be cured. He thus set about removing any of his patients' body parts which could potentially harbor harmful bacteria, starting with their teeth. So enthusiastic was Cotton that he even removed his own children's teeth as a precaution, as well as his own, when he believed himself to be going insane. When pulling teeth did not achieve the desired results, Cotton moved on to other organs, gleefully excising his patients' testicles, ovaries, spleen, stomachs, gallbladder, cervixes, and, of course, colons. Cotton reported a phenomenal success rate of 85%, winning him widespread acclaim among his fellow psychiatrists. While horrifically misguided and reckless by today's standards, Dr. Cotton's methods were actually remarkably progressive for their day. The psychoanalytic idea of Sigmund Freud had not yet caught on with the mainstream psychiatric community, and the eugenics-based theories of the time held that mental illness was the result of inferior genes and could only be eliminated from society by sterilizing the mentally ill. Meyer and Cotton's theories, by contrast, framed mental illness as a physical affliction like any other, curable via physical intervention. Cotton's methods proved especially attractive among the upper classes who flocked to New Jersey to experience his miracle cure. Among his highest-profile clients were Margaret Fisher, daughter of famed Yale economist Irvin Fisher, who in 1919 was diagnosed with schizophrenia and transferred to Trenton to undergo treatment. Cotton attributed her condition to, well, what else other than chronic constipation, and proceeded to remove her colon. Tragically, Fisher suffered a fate which befell up to 45% of Cotton's patients, succumbing to a massive streptococcus infection. However, despite these high mortality rates, Cotton's crusade carried on unimpeded for decades, the medical community making only a minimal effort to investigate the validity of his claims. Indeed, following a 1925 investigation into Trenton State Hospital by the New Jersey State Senate, the New York Times reported that eminent physicians and surgeons testified that the New Jersey State Hospital for the Insane was the most progressive institution in the world for the care of the insane, and that the newer method of treating the insane by the removal of focal infection placed the institution in a unique position with respect to hospitals for the mentally ill. However, that same year, Cotton left Trenton State and established his own private clinic, which was less subject to government oversight and regulation. There, he carried on performing his radical surgeries for wealthy clients until his retirement in 1930. By this time, advances in medical technology had begun to undermine the assumptions which had underpinned the radical methods of William Lane, Henry Cotton, and others. X-rays dispelled the notion that wastes stagnate and putrefy in the colon for days on end, while blood tests revealed that even the most chronic constipation produces no significant rise in toxins in the bloodstream. Indeed, doctors began to realize that humanity's hysterical obsession with constipation, regularity, and intestinal cleanliness was grossly misinformed and overblown, with British gastroenterologist Sir Arthur Hurst stating in 1935 that constipation should be defined as any condition that causes the patient to complain that his bowels are not moving often enough. One man's constipation is another man's diarrhea. People have become a vast army of hypochondriacs who are never happy unless their stools conform to an ideal which they have invented by themselves. Furthermore, doctors discovered that far from being a useless vestigial organ, the colon, in fact, plays a vital role in reabsorbing water and minerals from solid wastes and contains beneficial bacteria that promote good digestion and produce vitamin K, which is essential for blood clotting. Yet, despite these revelations, the oldest of obsessions has really never gone away, and to this day, countless fad diets, alternative medicine gurus, and high-fiber cereals continue to extol the dubious virtues of regularity and flushing the colon of harmful toxins. Nor until recently did we fully abandon our obsession with removing perfectly healthy body parts. For nearly a century, few British or American children made it through grade school with their tonsils intact, regardless of whether said organs were diseased in the first place. A 1934 study of 1,000 New York school children found that 61% had received tonsillectomies, and the doctors had recommended surgery for all but 75 of the remaining 390 children. Tonsillectomy soon became the third most commonly performed surgery in the English-speaking world, being performed on 80,000 British schoolchildren every year. This crusade against tonsils was initially inspired by the same focal infection theory which had driven the radical surgeries of Dr. Henry Cotton, with the tonsils being seen by leading surgeons like Dr. George Waugh as particularly pernicious sites of chronic infection. However, the practice persisted long after the abandonment of such theories and the development of antibiotics, and came to be seen, along with vaccination against measles and polio, as merely another necessary preventative measure against childhood disease. It was not until 1978 that the National Institutes of Health examined the statistical evidence and concluded that not only was tonsillectomy far less effective at preventing throat infections than previously believed, but that the risk of post-operative complications far outweighed any perceived benefits of the surgery. Mass preventative tonsillectomy of schoolchildren was soon abandoned, and today the surgery is only performed in cases of chronic and persistent tonsil infection. It just goes to show that while medical science evidently advances and learns from its mistakes, sometimes much of what we think we know about the human body is, like our colons, completely full of shit.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today we're answering a viewer question. Ron G asks, what do hospitals do with limbs of people they amputate? Like, if I have a limb amputated, can I ask for it back? So it's standard procedure in most hospitals to incinerate any limbs, organs, or tissue that they remove from a non-organ donor patient. However, just because this is the way things are normally done, it's not necessarily the way it has to be done. For example, while there almost universally doesn't seem to be any law saying you have rights to an amputated limb after a doctor removes it, in many cases you can ask for anything cut off or removed from your body back from the hospital, and they'll usually say yes if pressed on the matter. Even where laws exist, they tend to be less about how to handle such tissue and more about getting around potential lawsuits. For example, in California, there is a law stating that patients cannot sue after the fact for the return of tissue used in medical research or for a share of the profits if the tissue removed leads to a medical breakthrough. We're actually going to touch more on this a little bit later in the bonus fact section, so do stay tuned. That said, prior to any surgery, hospital representatives will invariably ask patients to sign a form that cedes ownership of their surgical leavings. They are usually left to the pathology lab for use in medical research or study. However, as a patient, you are entirely within your rights to not sign such a form and request ownership of any piece of your body removed during surgery. But as previously alluded to, hospitals and doctors won't always make this easy for you and will often tell you that it isn't possible owing to removed bits being a bit of a biohazard. While this sounds like a totally reasonable explanation, in truth this is usually just something hospital representatives say when a hospital has a policy against returning removed bits, generally from wanting to avoid jumping through the additional effort involved in returning a body part. As lawyer and author of The Law of Human Remains, Tanya Mash notes, when they don't want to do something, they'll tell people it's illegal. That doesn't mean it's illegal. A lot of people just cave when they're told it's not permitted. Or as PBS succinctly states, unless a piece of removed tissue contains a communicable disease or virus, keeping your own body parts isn't inherently any more dangerous than keeping a steak. And even if you have a communicable disease, the common practice of preserving the tissue or limb submersed in a solution of water and formaldehyde will usually kill off any such diseases. This makes the often claimed biohazard excuse for not returning your body part generally pretty bogus. For example, you can consider the case of Christy Loyal, who, upon being told she needed to have her foot amputated owing to cancer, she asked the hospital for it back, only to be stonewalled by doctors who told her that this wasn't possible. Nevertheless, she insisted, and after hounding the hospital about the issue for several weeks, they agreed to return it. It's also noteworthy here that while they initially said it wasn't possible, the hospital actually had a liability release form on file specifically for use when returning removed body parts. After signing the form and getting her foot and part of her leg back, Loyal paid $650 to a private company to skeletonize it. Hilariously, she actually maintains an Instagram account called One Foot Wanderer, where she takes various photos with said foot, such as this glorious shot of her using her skeletonized foot as a golf club. When asked if she had any advice for people who similarly wanted to keep an amputated limb, Loyal explained that it was important to just be persistent and keep reminding everyone that you are getting it back. As for exactly what condition you'll get your limb, organ, or tissue back in, this will usually depend on the tests the pathologist conducts on it and the manner in which it is removed. Things like kidney stones, for example, will normally be destroyed by the tests performed on them after the fact, if not the method used to remove them in the first place. Because of this, while you can theoretically ask for anything removed from your body back, occasionally this really won't be possible. But where possible, and if you do insist, the general process is that the organ, tissue, or limb will be sent off to a pathology lab. Among other things, this will be to ensure that it's kept pathogen-free. It will also be preserved in some way, usually, as mentioned, in a solution including formaldehyde. You will also have to sign a liability release form before it will be returned to you. Once back in your possession in most regions, you're free to do with it as you please. One man, Leo Bonton, even created a rather fetching, if a little creepy, lamp out of his leg. As for what happens if you're interested in selling your former body part, with a few exceptions, this is largely entirely within your rights, as there aren't really very much in the way of regulations in the United States and many other countries about the ownership or sale of human remains. The exception to this in the United States is primarily regarding the sale or ownership of Native American remains, which are protected by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Do take note, though, that if you live in the states of Louisiana, Georgia, or Missouri, that they do have some specific laws pertaining to restricting the sale of body parts. Over in the United Kingdom, things are only slightly different, with the decision of what to do with the amputated limbs and removed tissue being left to the discretion of the hospital trusts and, in some cases, the individual surgeon performing the amputation itself. However, as long as the patient makes their wishes clear and signs the necessary forms, in most cases one shouldn't have significant issue getting the bits of yourself back. Also, as in the United States, tests need to be performed to ensure the tissue or limb doesn't pose a public health risk, and it will need to be properly preserved before being returned. One thing that is different in the UK, though, is that due to a quirk in British law, one of the few things a patient can't do with an amputated limb once they get it back is have it cremated at a licensed crematorium. As noted in a paper published in the BMJ, formerly British Medical Journal, in the paper Dr. Simon Marlowe also muses over the fact that although you can't legally have a crematorium cremate your limb after it's amputated, you could ask for it back and burn it yourself. And of course, if the limb is not going to be used for medical research, hospitals themselves almost universally will incinerate the limb anyway, which is all perfectly legal. It's just the crematoriums that can't do it. But to sum up here, it would seem in most regions of the world, as long as the bits of you removed don't pose a significant health risk to the general public, while many a doctor or hospital, particularly research hospitals, may resist if you ask for a body part back, if you're insistent enough, you'll likely have good luck in having it returned. And once you have it back, for the most part, you're pretty free to do with it as you please. Now, obviously, losing a limb is nearly always less than ideal, unless I suppose you have body integrity identity disorder, but for those who persist on finding the positive in any situation, if the aforementioned Christy Loyal is any indication, there are a lot of hilarious things you can do with your severed limb. And that was some bonus facts. The general lack of laws concerning what you can do with body parts can result in a number of unique quandaries, such as in the case of a South Carolina man, John Wood, who left his leg in an old barbecue smoker after having it amputated in the hopes of someday having it buried alongside him when he died. This plan was cut short when the barbecue was purchased by another man, Shannon Wisenant, when Wood fell on hard times. Indeed, Wood failed to remember that he had put the leg in there and never removed it from the barbecue. After having the police confirm that the leg wasn't part of a murder case or some other foul play, Wisenant had the leg embalmed and began charging neighbors to look at it, prompting a furious Wood to sue him to have the leg returned. The problem was that although the leg unequivocally once belonged to Wood, Wisenant was now its legal owner. The case was eventually settled on the Judge Mathis show, with Wisenant being ordered to return the leg and Wood being ordered to pay Wisenant $5,000 for it. And now for another bonus fact. The California law stating that patients can't sue after the fact for the return of tissue used in medical research or for a share of the profits if the tissue removed led to a medical breakthrough was solidified by the Supreme Court of California in 1990 after a hairy cell leukemia patient called John Moore discovered that, without his knowledge or consent, cells from his body were used to develop a new treatment to help those being treated for cancer and various other conditions. In a nutshell, doctors discovered that his cells were producing a protein that stimulates the growth of white blood cells. Ultimately, the doctors involved were able to use his cells to develop a cell line used for creating the protein GM-CSF, which in turn is used to boost the immune system of those undergoing cancer treatments and other instances where such a boost can be beneficial. Moore became suspicious that something weird was going on, owing to the doctors having him fly down to California from Washington on a monthly basis for years, continually taking blood samples, despite there being no medical reason for this to happen so frequently. The whole thing got even weirder after he asked to have his checkups transferred to a local doctor, and the doctor in charge of Moore's care, Dr. David Gold, countered by offering to pay all of Moore's travel expenses for each visit to LA. Eventually, Dr. Gold asked Moore to sign a consent form which stated, "I voluntarily grant to the University of California all rights I or my heirs may have in any cell line or other potential product which might be developed from the blood and or bone marrow obtained from me." Even still, they did not tell him why they wanted him to sign this, nor that they were already using his cells. It wasn't until Moore hired an attorney to look into the matter that the attorney discovered a cell line had been developed and patented using Moore's genetic material, and further, that Dr. Gold had been granted 75,000 shares in the patent. Further, his group was given $330,000 for exclusive access to Moore's genetic material. Moore thus argued that he was entitled to a share of the profits, not just because it was his genetic material used, but also because, had he been informed in the first place, he could have potentially sold his genetic material to other labs or companies wanting to do similar research on his blood. Despite all of this, the ruling of the court went against Moore, primarily because doctors have long regularly used samples from patients for research, with one of the judges noting that allowing patients to sue in this way would create a litigation lottery that could kneecap medical research in an unprecedented manner. Thus, while isolated instances may seem a bit unfair, in the end, a greater societal good is achieved by allowing such research without a lot of red tape. The California Supreme Court did, however, note that doctors needed to inform patients when using their tissue for research. In the end, even though the court did not order it, as a sort of apology, UCLA Medical Center paid Moore's legal fees because he wasn't informed about what they were doing with his cells each time they were having him fly down, and he hadn't agreed to allow his cells to be used for research. This tradition stems back to the early days of the Amish, when wearing elaborate moustaches was common among those in the military. In fact, this became so popular that from 1860 to 1916, British soldiers were actually required to have moustaches. The Amish, being a pacifist group, not just in war but also in all confrontation, which is why they prefer the term non-resistance to pacifism, didn't want to associate themselves with those who waged war, so they strictly forbade their members from growing moustaches. Today, few men in the Western world choose to grow moustaches, but this tradition remains among the old order Amish people, which number about 200,000 in North America. While moustaches are not allowed, beards are practically a requirement among the Amish due to beards being common among men in the Bible. However, not all Amish men are traditionally allowed to grow beards. It isn't until an Amish man gets married that he will stop shaving his beard and allow it to grow out, with beards being a mark of an Amish male having become a man. And now for a bonus fact. The specific British military command requiring soldiers to have a moustache was Command Number 1695 of the King's Regulations. It read, "The hair of the head will be kept short, the chin and under the lip will be shaved, but not the upper lip." Initially adopted at the tail end of the 1700s from the French, who also required their soldiers to have facial hair which varied depending on the type of soldier, sappers, infantry, etc., this follicular fashion statement was all about virility and aggression. Beard and moustache growth was rampant, especially in India, where bare faces were scorned as being juvenile and unmanly, as well as in Arab countries where moustaches and beards were likewise associated with power. It wasn't all plain sailing for the moustache, though. Back home, British citizens were looking on it as a sign of their boys going native, and it was nearly stamped out completely. However, in 1584, after significant campaigning, moustaches became compulsory for the troops of the East India Company's Bombay Army. While not in the rules for everyone else yet, they were still widely taken up across the armed forces, and during the Crimean War, there were a wide variety of permissible and often over-the-top styles. By the 1860s, moustaches were finally compulsory for all armed forces, and they became as much an emblem for the armed forces as the army uniform. In 1916, the regulation was dropped, and troops were allowed to be clean-shaven again. This is largely because such a superficial requirement was getting ignored in the trenches of World War I, especially as facial hair could sometimes get in the way of a good gas mask seal. The order to abolish the moustache requirement was signed on October 6, 1916 by General Sir Neville Macready, who himself hated moustaches and was glad to finally shave his off. While no longer in force today, there are still regulations governing moustaches, and if worn, they can grow no further than the upper lip. It is also still extremely common for British soldiers in Afghanistan to wear beards, as facial hair is still associated with power and authority in many Islamic regions.
In the video today, we are going to answer a viewer question because LIAL asks us, why do we have moles all over our body? And what do they do? Moles in general are simply an abnormal grouping of cells called melanocytes. Melanocytes are the cells responsible for giving your skin its pigment. They reside in the basal layer of your skin and overall have a surprisingly uniform distribution. Their density will vary depending on the part of the body they reside in. For example, there are around 900 melanocytes per square millimeter on your back and around 1,500 per square millimeter around your genitals. During fetal development, their progression stops at the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. They don't just reside in your skin, however, they're also found in the cochlea of your ear, the iris of your eye, and the part of your brainstem called your mesencephalon. When melanocytes group together, it's called a nest. These nests will show up as a mole. While it isn't fully understood why moles develop, it's known that most begin during fetal development. If you're born with a mole, it's termed congenital. About 1 in 100 people are born with congenital moles, and they'll vary greatly in size and shape depending on the person. Should your mole present itself after you're born, it's called an acquired mole. Acquired moles are so common that many researchers argue they shouldn't even be referred to as an abnormality. Almost everyone has at least one, and most people with light skin have between 10 and 40. No one has definitively shown why someone will acquire a mole, but there are risk factors such as increased exposure to UV light and many genetic causes, including mutations to certain types of genes. These types are usually round, symmetrical, and have the same color throughout, usually brown, tan, black, or red. Almost all are smaller than a pencil eraser. Both congenital and acquired moles are considered typical, and dermatologists generally note you shouldn't worry about them. Simply check them over time, noting their size, shape, and color as you age. If they do change significantly, it could be a sign of melanoma, or a cancer of your melanocytes, and thus such changes should be checked out by a professional. The higher number of moles you have, the greater your chance of getting melanoma. That is pretty much common sense, because the more you have, the greater chance one of them will start dividing at an uncontrolled rate. This brings us to atypical moles, also known as dysplastic nevus or Clark nevus. They're usually larger than a pencil eraser, tend to have shapes that aren't round, and will show more than one color, usually with mixed shades of brown, red, and pink. There are three main types of atypical moles, and they can also be either inherited or sporadically acquired. Since many melanomas are mutated from atypical moles, should you have these, check them occasionally. There is some confusion among doctors as to how often you should check them, because studies have consistently shown that about half of atypical moles will change over the course of 89 months, and they aren't a problem at all. The exact chance of having one of yours turn into something more sinister is still only about 1 in 200,000. Of course, while the risk is extremely low, since we're talking about cancer, if you're worried, get it checked. The three main types of atypical moles are spritz nevus, melanocytic nevus, and the dreaded melanoma. Melanocytic nevus are basically just moles that are classified as benign tumors. Note, they're named the same thing as typically acquired moles, but it seems the literature separates them out because they tend to be larger, appear later in life, and have somewhat specific causes. The exact mechanisms that make the grouping of melanocytes so large that they become tumors isn't fully known. It's thought that one ingredient might be from a type of growth factor released by a skin cell, keratinocyte, after a traumatic event, something like a second-degree burn, a severe sunburn, or any exposure to UV light, or disease processes like toxic epidermal necrolysis and epidermolysis bullosa. Even though men and women have the same rates of development, there does appear to be some involvement with sex hormones. It's known that pregnant women tend to have theirs darken or enlarge. They've also been shown to have receptors for two sex hormones, androgens and estrogens. Since melanocytic nevus responds to these hormones, it's thought the receptors are the reason. This brings us to spritz nevus. These little malformations are so similar to melanoma, most dermatologists can't distinguish them from their cancerous counterparts. Nearly all are dome-like and pink. Some, however, do have a red, black, or brown appearance and have been known to bleed or ooze. They normally occur in the first 20 years of life. Now to cancer. Melanoma, on average, kills 1 American every hour. In fact, the vast majority of people who die from skin cancer are those with melanoma. Melanoma cases are growing at an alarming rate. For women before the age of 44, it's increased annually by 6.1%, and overall melanoma rates have doubled in the US from 1982 to 2011. UV exposure is thought to be one of the biggest contributors to the increase. In fact, the use of a tanning bed before the age of 30 will increase your risk of getting melanoma by 75%. But even just with the sun, if you like baking like a cake, just stop doing that. No one wants leathery skin at 40 or a deadly disease, so use sunscreen, and for those trying to darken up, instead learn to accept you for you. As ever, it's not about the color of your skin, but the content of your character. Dead bodies don't have much character. The two main ways to get melanoma are genetic, or as stated previously, one of the moles you have turns against you and becomes cancerous. The overall risk of melanoma, if you're white, is about 1 in 150. The chance of a typical mole turning into melanoma is about 1 in 200,000. But your risk can reach as high as 100% if you have a condition called familial atypical multiple mole melanoma syndrome, or FAM. FAM is a problem in which someone has over 50 moles, usually many more, some are atypical, and have a blood relative who has melanoma. If you're freckled with moles like zits on a teenager, you might want to make sure you have a good dermatologist and then become best friends with them. As with all types of moles, the exact mechanism behind melanoma, or FAM, isn't exactly known. What has been shown is that those with melanoma have gene mutations, specifically changes to genes CDK2NA, CDK4, and CMM1. Interestingly, 3 mutated genes, PTEN, BRAF, and MCR1, are associated with melanoma, but not with people who have simple sporadic atypical moles. Some people who acquire melanoma from atypical moles will also have mutations to tumor-suppressing genes. No matter what genes are involved, every study shows that exposure to UV light will greatly increase your chance of having atypical moles that turn into melanoma. In the end, almost every light-skinned person on the planet has mold. The majority of people will never have to worry about anything ominous with them. But no matter the type, if you're worried about it at all, get it checked by a dermatologist. The 5-year survival rate for melanoma is 98% if it's caught before it spreads to your lymph nodes. Past that point, it decreases dramatically to around 18%. So keep tabs on your blemishes. If nothing else, it may give you an excuse to ask someone to stare at you naked. For your health. The effort put forth could then lead to a carnal reduction in the stress that you had about them in the first place.
Now for some bonus facts. Melanin has two types of pigments, and they are essential in determining your hair color. Eumelanin, dark brown and black, and pheomelanin, yellow, red, and light brown. Along with melanin, the pigments involved in determining your skin color are hemoglobin, red, hemosiderin, brown, carotene, yellow, orange, or red, and bilin, yellow. And now for another bonus fact. The density of melanocytes on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet is 5-fold less than other parts of your body. This is why even dark-complexioned people will have lighter palms and soles. In the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Erica H asks us, how do we pee in terms of the nuts and bolts of it? Why can we only pee sometimes and not just any time that there is liquid in our bladders? What's the trigger, and how exactly is the pee expelled once the floodgates do open? Is it just gravity, or do our stomach muscles squeeze our bladders? Inquiring minds want to know. This is a seriously detailed question about pee, so let's get into it. An average healthy adult responds to nature's call anywhere between 4 and 10 times each day. The need to take a leak begins when pressure on the bladder rises, stretching the bladder wall, which is made up of bands of smooth muscle, detrusor muscles that are filled with beta-adreneric receptors that send and receive messages between the muscle cells and the nervous system. When the bladder is initially stretching as it fills via the uterus propelling urine from the kidneys to your bladder, messages are sent from the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight part of the autonomic nervous system, via the hypogastric nerve to the detrusor muscles, telling them to suppress the urge to contract. At this point, you experience no urge to pee, and even if you wanted to, unless you're experiencing some sort of renal system issue, you typically won't be able to without doing something to squeeze the bladder manually, pushing on it directly, using your abdominal muscles, etc. This is due to an internal urethral sphincter keeping things closed tight, along with the lack of squeezing by the detrusor, both controlled by your autonomic nervous system. As the urine in the bladder reaches approximately 1/4 to half full, however, the stretch receptors in the detrusor, as well as other receptors in and around the opening to the urethra, the tube that runs from the bladder to the outside world, signal back to the sacral region of the spinal cord, triggering the micturition reflex, as well as letting your brain and you know that it's time to take a leak. The parasympathetic system kicks in and signals the detrusor muscles to now alternate between contracting and relaxing in a process known as a micturition wave. If you choose to simply hold it, the brain sends impulses down the spinal cord, inhibiting the micturition reflex, particularly making sure your external urethral sphincter is ignoring a secondary action of the micturition reflex, which is telling your voluntary external sphincter it should go ahead and relax and let the urine flow. These impulses from the brain thus make sure that this sphincter stays clamped shut until you decide it's time to pee. However, the longer you continue to hold it, the less effective this is, and the more intense and frequent this micturition wave will be. This is until it reaches a level where the detrusor contracts for a long time. This is the point where you really, really need to go. But if you're on a road trip and you'd prefer not to stop and you don't have some form of travel urinal, you can still travel urinal. What? Just stop. Jesus. But if you're on a road trip and you'd prefer not to stop and you don't have some sort of handy travel urinal, you can still generally, until things become absolutely critical, tell your external urethral sphincter that it's really not a good time and consciously make sure that it stays closed. However, this system is going to continually remind you on occasion that your bladder can only expand so much. As alluded to, all the time you're searching for a suitable spot, your brain is working with other muscles helping to prevent an accident. An internal automatically controlled sphincter surrounds the neck of the bladder where it meets the urethra, and the voluntarily controlled muscles of your pelvic floor form the external sphincter that supports the muscles of the urethra itself. Working together, these help you hold it in if you're so inclined. Also, if your renal system is working properly, a sort of one-way valve at each of the two connection points of the uterus and the bladder makes sure urine isn't squeezed back up the uterus into your kidneys, via the detrusor and ureter muscles creating a 1 to 2 centimeter compression point, squeezing that section of your ureters shut at appropriate times. When you are finally ready to relieve yourself, if your detrusor isn't already bearing down. I don't know why that's funny.
When you're finally ready to relieve yourself, if your detrusor isn't already bearing down, you'll typically increase the pressure in your bladder via your abdominal muscles. This triggers an unsuppressed micturition reflex, at which point your automatically controlled internal sphincter is relaxed, as is the voluntary external urethral sphincter that the now higher centers of your brain aren't telling to stay squeezed shut. And then your detrusor muscles give a good long squeeze. The result of all of this is the majority of your bladder contents being squeezed out, with typically about 50 or so milliliters remaining. Ah, sweet relief. And now for a bonus fact. You can monitor your health by observing the color of your pee. If it's pale or transparent yellow, you're good to go, and if it's dark yellow, you just need to take a little water. If it's honey-colored, you're a bit dehydrated, and if it's the color of maple syrup, you probably have a problem which could include severe dehydration or even liver disease. Pink pee could indicate anything from kidney disease to prostate problems or a urinary tract infection, although if you've eaten beets or blueberries, it could just be that. Orange is also troubling, but could be anything from food dye to a bile duct condition. Blue or green urine typically comes from food dye or medication, but there is a rare genetic condition that can cause this color. If your urine is completely clear, you're probably drinking a lot of water, and in the extreme case, should maybe cut back, because it's possible, though rare, to kill yourself via drinking too much water, with a variety of ways that this could kill you. For instance, in 2003, doctors reported the death of a 64-year-old woman who had consumed anywhere between 30 and 40 glasses of water over a single evening, all the while hysterically exclaiming that she needed more. She ultimately died in her sleep that night. After an autopsy was performed, the cause of death was determined to be hypotonemia as a result of acute water intoxication. In the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Michael A. asks us, does testosterone cause more body hair? Testosterone is a steroid hormone from a group called androgens. Androgens affect a lot of different characteristics in our bodies, like the development of the male sex organs, the deepening of the voice during puberty, muscle and bone strength, as well as hair growth. Interestingly, the same circulating androgen, like testosterone, can increase hair growth in one area of our bodies and inhibit it in others. Thought to be gene-dependent, these differences affect our appearance in several ways. Before we tackle why, it's important to understand how testosterone is produced and how hair grows. Testosterone is produced by specialized cells called Leydig cells in the male testes and in the female ovaries. They do this by receiving signals from your anterior pituitary gland. The pituitary senses the need for more testosterone and signals the Leydig cells with a hormone known as luteinizing hormone. Cholesterol is used to make steroid hormones known as progesterone and progenolone. These are then transformed into testosterone. The luteinizing hormone coming from your pituitary gland increases the rate at which this happens. Once testosterone is made, it begins to circulate around the body looking for receptor sites to attach to. Known as androgen receptors, in the case of hair, they reside in an area of your hair follicle called your dermal papilla. Once there, the testosterone androgen binds to androgen receptors and initiates any altered gene expression. This will either help the follicle or it will hurt it, depending on the gene expressed. Hair, like other cells in our bodies, have a growth cycle. There are three phases. Anagen, this is the active growth stage. 80 to 85% of hair is in this phase. Catagen, this phase is also known as the transitional phase, when hair begins to stop growing. And telogen, this is the phase when hair growth is completely shut down and the fibers fall out. 10 to 15% of our hair is in this phase at any given time. After your hair goes through the telogen phase, anagen begins again, and voila, more hair. The cycle then repeats itself throughout our lifetimes. Testosterone regulates hair growth by affecting the follicle and how it can produce the different types of hair, like facial, pubic, and scalp hair. These follicle changes affect the growth phases of hair, producing different reactions. The result is changes in hair growth, or lack thereof, occurring over time, as the growth cycle of hair can take as long as 7 years to complete. What has baffled researchers for decades is how a hormone like androgen can cause some hair's growth to be inhibited in one area of the body while helping it to grow in others. This paradox appears to be gene-related. There are two types of hair follicles within our bodies, vellus and terminal. Vellus hair follicles are the ones that create fine, virtually colorless hair like the ones found on infants. They are usually tiny and don't reside very deep within the skin. Terminal hair follicles are created from vellus hair follicles by androgen. They are deeper and longer follicles that form thicker, longer, and more pigmented hair. To change from vellus to terminal or from terminal to vellus, the follicle must go through the hair growth cycle to regenerate as one type or another. Normally, during puberty, our bodies begin to produce more androgen. This circulating androgen then turns our young vellus follicles into more terminal ones, and thus the boy becomes a man. As time goes on, certain terminal hair follicles, like the ones found on our scalp, can begin to regress back into vellus follicles. This, too, is mediated by testosterone. The result is slowly dying hair follicles that don't grow back. What researchers have found is that individual hair follicles have different expressions of genes within the follicle. Each gene expression reacts differently to androgen. Some genes inhibit follicle health and some increase follicle health. Since each follicle is independent of one another, each gene expression is also independent of one another. This is why hair transplants work. The follicles on your head, they might be dying, but the ones in other areas of your body are not, so doctors can simply move them. The transplanted hair follicle will not die because the genes associated with that follicle are not negatively affected by androgen, no matter what area of the body they're in. The process that allows a specific gene to be expressed in a certain follicle is not yet fully understood. What is known is that the programming occurs in the pattern processing during development. And now for some bonus facts. The higher the testosterone level is in vitro, the greater ability you will have to grow a beard. Now for another bonus fact. Certain bodybuilders and other athletes love to take testosterone supplements or other steroids to increase muscle mass. While this works quite effectively, excessive testosterone can cause several problems. They include heart muscle damage, acne, low sperm count, shrinking of the testicles, prostate enlargement, liver disease, high blood pressure, insomnia, and headaches. Low testosterone can also cause problems. In adulthood, this may decrease your sexual desire, cause erectile dysfunction, loss of hair, osteoporosis, and a decrease in your muscle mass. There are times, however, when this is not such a bad thing. In the case of prostate cancer, testosterone is thought to stimulate the prostate gland and cause the cancer to grow. As a result, if you have prostate cancer, doctors sometimes prescribe medications to reduce your testosterone level, like leuprolide. In some extreme cases, castration can also be performed, but in that case, maybe I'll just take the prostate cancer. Dark. Today we're answering a viewer question because Brandy N asks us, how do other primates deal with the umbilical cord and placenta when the baby is born, when they don't have any sort of medical help to make sure everything's handled right? Other than certain modern humans, some marine mammals like whales and dolphins, chimpanzees, and a few domesticated animals, mammal mothers typically eat the afterbirth. While most humans have all that mess dealt with in hospital, cetaceans enjoy a rather explosive expulsion of the placental into seawater. On the other hand, chimpanzee mothers are said to ignore the matter entirely and simply haul around baby, placenta, and cord until the latter dries up and drops off, usually in about a day. For most of the rest, however, the mothers eat not only the placenta and the cord, but they tend to ingest a fair bit of amniotic fluid as well while cleaning the affected areas. Researchers have several hypotheses to explain placentophagia, and these include hygiene, to reduce odors that may attract predators, to replenish nutrients lost during pregnancy, and also to acquire additional hormones. Another hypothesis for the practice is that by gobbling up the afterbirth, the mother will naturally come into contact with her young, and by licking them clean, this contact will stimulate bonding and caretaking behaviors. Neuroscientists have other hypotheses, and these include that ingestion of the afterbirth, and in particular the amniotic fluid, may enhance naturally occurring pregnancy-induced analgesia. They propose that since amniotic fluid appears before any fetus pops out, by cleaning it off through ingestion, the mother may also be ingesting a substance that boosts her brain's ability to produce natural painkillers. Similarly, there is some evidence to support the idea that in the same way afterbirth boosts endogenous opioid production to alleviate pain, those additional opioids may also stimulate maternal behaviors. Given all these potential benefits for animals and how relatively common it is amongst our mammalian compatriots, it has led some to wonder if placentophagia might well be beneficial for human mothers as well, and if it ever was a common practice among humans. As for the latter question, a thorough review of anthropological literature was conducted in 2010 and did not find a single example of afterbirth eating as
as a common custom in any documented culture, although some still speculate that in the past it must have been practiced widely at some point in human history, and there are certainly known anecdotal instances, particularly in more relatively recent times. On that note, in ultra-modern times, this practice has become a thing among some, and increasingly new mothers are saving their placentas and ingesting them later. This all makes us ponder whether this actually counts as a form of cannibalism, which is defined as the practice of eating the flesh of one's own species. And speaking of birth-related things, if you search around enough, you'll inevitably find many a mildly humorous heated argument over whether swallowing human sperm counts as cannibalism, as it's technically flesh of a sort. Going back to placentas, adherents claim all manner of benefits with consumption of the organ, including increased strength, relief from postpartum depression and mood swings, improving lactation, and accelerating the mother's recovery. The most common way to ingest the placenta today is in capsule form. Termed a traditional Chinese method to make placenta pills, first the organ is steamed. In some recipes with ginger, hot pepper, and lemon. Then it is chopped, dehydrated, ground into powder, and placed in capsules. Placenta can also be made into a tincture, cooked like other meats, or just eaten raw in a blended smoothie. Of course, the pills seem to be the most popular option. So, does it really work? Despite its increasing popularity, there remains little in the way of any specific evidence to support adherents' claims, and unfortunately, there hasn't been a single double-blind study as of the writing of this script that tests the afterbirth pill's effectiveness. Another emerging placental trend is to leave the umbilical cord attached to the newborn until it falls off on its own, which could occur within 10 days. Called a lotus birth, proponents claim that it fosters bonding and has health benefits for the baby. One mother who chose such a birth in 2013 noted that since the placenta didn't release for several hours after birth, she and the baby enjoyed a prolonged bonding period. In her account, over the next few days, the placenta was given a daily bath and kept in a waterproof bag. Her baby, Ulysses, and the placenta went everywhere together, and at night Ulysses slept with his parents on the bed with the placenta placed to one side. After 6 days, like his famous namesake, young Ulysses had apparently had enough and finally took matters into his own hands. When his parents woke up, they found their brave baby grasping the severed cord, which he had yanked off by himself. And now for a bonus fact. Speaking of animal births, it turns out, unlike so many other animals, in seahorses, the female impregnates the male, who will later go on to give birth. As for the specifics, the reproductive process of a seahorse begins when a male and female meet up and dance. For several days prior to the actual act of mating, the two fish, yes, they are fish, will meet to intertwine their tails and swim together. They also sometimes grip the same strand of seagrass with their tails and whirl it around in unison. Scientists believe this courtship and dancing synchronizes the movements of the two fish to prepare the male to receive the eggs at the same time that the female is ready to deposit them. After several days of this, the male blows water through an egg pouch on his stomach. The water flow expands and opens the pouch to demonstrate to the female that it is empty and ready for her to insert her ovipositor, an organ that is used to lay eggs. At that point, the two swim in a sort of snout-to-snout embrace, spiraling upward through the water, trying to line up so the female can insert her ovipositor into the male's pouch. She does this several times, resting between to avoid becoming exhausted. As the eggs leave the female body, she slims down. As the male receives the eggs, he plumps up. The process can last up to 8 hours. In the end, she deposits anywhere from a few dozen to a few thousand eggs into the male's pouch, depending on the species of seahorse. When it's done, the female does not stay to cuddle, but simply swims away and finds a nice place to rest while her ovipositor contracts, which can take a couple of hours. After his lady friend is gone, the male attaches himself to a nearby plant and is left to finish the job by himself, releasing sperm directly into the water around him to fertilize the eggs, which are now embedded in the wall of his pouch. The pouch provides oxygen and prolactin to nurture the eggs. While the female chose to leave right after the mating, she's at least nice enough to drop by and check up on her pregnant partner. During the gestation period, anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, the female visits the male on a daily basis, though not for long. The two simply interacting for a few minutes each time, swimming together, much like they did during courtship. In the minutes immediately preceding birth, his muscles contort, bending him backwards and forward repeatedly for about 10 minutes until all the babies, known as fry, explode out of the pouch. There can be as few as 8 and as many as 200 seahorse fry born at a single time.
Amazingly, the male's pouch returns to its normal size and position in only about an hour, and he is ready to mate again within a few hours, and sometimes he even does. The male seahorse may give birth, but as with many fish, he does not stick around to nurture the young, but leaves them on their own. In the end, around 5 infant seahorses in every 1,000 survive into adulthood. Many are eaten by predators or die of starvation when ocean currents push them too far away from food sources. Even so, by fish standards, 5 out of 1,000 is actually a pretty good rate thanks to the father's pouch protecting the little ones for a time, while other fish often just lay eggs and immediately abandon them after fertilization.
Pretty much all guys have been there at some point or another. The doctor asks you to drop your drawers, they slap on some latex gloves, grab your junk, and ask you to turn your head and cough. One imagines this can't exactly be the highlight of the doctor's day, probably ranking up there with the lovely process involved in probing prostates for potential problems. So what exactly are they looking for when they ask you to turn your head and cough? Well, in one word, that would be hernias, but because this is a Today I Found Out video, we're going to dive a lot more into detail. More specifically, they are searching for something called inguinal in a groin hernia, which accounts for about 70 to 80% of all hernia cases and is surprisingly common in men and not nearly so much in women. There's a lifetime risk of 27% for men versus just 3% for women due to the much smaller opening in women's superficial inguinal ring than men's. In fact, inguinal hernia surgery is one of the most common surgeries performed on kids and teenagers. Inguinal hernias happen when certain soft tissues, particularly lower intestines, start to come through the lower abdominal wall through a small hole or tear in said wall. So, well, how exactly does grabbing a guy's balls help the doctor check for this? Well, it turns out that they aren't actually grabbing your balls at all, as is often alluded to in many a comedic skit. What they are doing is poking their fingers up and around the inguinal canal above the testicles. The inguinal canal runs down about where your leg and torso meet and is also the canal the spermatic cord passes through. It's attached to the testicles. For women, ligaments pass through this canal to hold the uterus in place. For both sexes, the ilioinguinal nerve passes through the inguinal canal. The inguinal canal has some common weak spots, so doctors are feeling around these weak spots and particularly looking to see if they can feel a bulge or other indications that something is poking through that should not be poking through. Often, this falls into the scrotum. Besides something in a guy's scrotum being there that should not be there, a slight bulge might also be visible where the upper thigh meets the groin. If either of these things happens, well, congratulations, you have an inguinal hernia. As to why the doctor will then have you stand and turn your head and cough, the first part is because the hernia may well disappear when you lay down, with the tissue receding back into your abdominal cavity. The second part of turning your head is simply for sanitary reasons. The doctor's already poking around your junk, they don't want to get coughed on as well. It's not exactly pleasant. As to why they ask you to cough, this creates internal pressure in your abdomen, so if some of the intestines or other soft tissue is protruding through your abdominal wall into your scrotum, or if there is an opening that tissue may exploit momentarily when pressure is added, coughing will help the doctor observe these things. Once found, it used to be common for doctors to immediately recommend that the hernia be fixed via surgery in order to avoid potentially life-threatening complications, such as if the intestines became strangled. This can cut off blood supply and potentially result in gangrenous tissue or an infection. This is usually done for minimal cases that don't cause any pain and are reducible. This means that the tissue can be pushed back inside the abdomen when pressure is applied or when the person lays down. Basically, here the tissue is not being incarcerated or obstructed, and the chance of that previously mentioned strangulation is minimal. The recent switch from recommending surgery for everyone who has it to the keep a close eye on it approach is because there is only about a 0.2% chance of the inguinal hernia becoming trapped. This compares to a 10 to 12% chance of people who have this particular hernia surgery ending up with post-surgery herniorrhaphy pain syndrome. This is basically just chronic groin pain that lasts more than a few months after the surgery was performed. So if the hernia isn't already causing pain or isn't too severe in size, the doctor may well simply recommend a treatment plan which won't actually fix it, but will help manage it. And now for some bonus facts. Hernias also commonly pop up in abdominal areas where you've had surgery. These are called incisional hernias. These are the second most common type of hernias after inguinal. The third most common is femoral, which is in the outer groin and occurs mostly in women, particularly pregnant or obese women. Then there are umbilical, belly button hernias, which are most common in babies or women who are pregnant, obese, or have given birth to several children. Then there's hiatal, which is upper stomach with the tissues protruding through the diaphragm where the esophagus passes through. This can often feel like heartburn, chest pain, or just indigestion. And now for another bonus fact. For teens particularly, doctors may take advantage of the fact that they have their hands near your balls to do a quick check of your testicles to make sure there aren't any signs of testicular cancer or other abnormalities. Testicular cancer is the second most common cancer that teenage boys get, so it's good to check, although it only occurs in about 0.0003% of teenage boys, so it's not exactly common, but, better safe than dead. And now another bonus fact. The word hernia, when it originally popped up, was spelled with an I like this, and that was in the 14th century. It comes from the Latin hernia, meaning protruded viscus or protruding organ. This is probably from the Proto-Indo-European gir, meaning gut or entrail.
In the second episode of the acclaimed television series Breaking Bad, high school chemistry teacher turned drug kingpin Walter White and his accomplice Jesse Pinkman find themselves in a rather sticky situation. Having just killed 2 drug dealers who kidnapped and forced them to cook methamphetamine at gunpoint, the pair must now find a way to dispose of the bodies. Drawing on his extensive knowledge of chemistry, Walt comes up with a cunning plan: dissolve the bodies in hydrofluoric acid. While Walt steals the requisite chemicals from the school lab, he sends Jesse to find a suitably large container to dissolve the bodies in, specifying that the container must be made out of polyethylene plastic. Unfortunately, Walt fails to explain the reasoning for this choice, and after failing to find a large enough container, Jesse simply places one of the bodies in a regular bathtub, pours the acid over it, and calls it a day. Turns out that's a bit of a mistake, for hours later the ceiling suddenly collapses in a spray of acid and gory pink chunks of flesh, the acid having not only dissolved the body, but also the enameled metal bathtub and the floor beneath it. Whoops-a-doodle. While the show's creators have claimed that the chemistry in the show is as accurate as they could make it, they have also admitted to fudging the truth in places to prevent viewers from trying Walt and Jesse's chemical antics at home. So, just how realistic is the dynamic duo's plan for dissolving a body? Can hydrofluoric acid actually reduce 80 kilograms of flesh and bone to pink paste within hours? Alas, for all of you aspiring drug kingpins out there, the answer is no. Indeed, it is curious that an expert chemist like Walter White would choose hydrofluoric acid as his corporeal solvent, not only because this chemical is particularly ill-suited to the task of dissolving human flesh, but because it is so dangerous that Walt and Jesse were lucky not to have wound up dead themselves. Hydrofluoric acid, or HF, consists of a fluorine atom bonded to a hydrogen atom, and like all acids, it will dissociate into its component ions when diluted in water. Because fluorine is one of the most reactive elements on the periodic table, hydrofluoric acid readily etches glass and silicon and will dissolve most metals except for nickel, gold, platinum, or silver, and most plastic except for polyethylene, Teflon, natural rubber, and neoprene. So Walt was at least right on that front. Yet, despite this corrosiveness, hydrofluoric acid is not, strangely enough, considered a strong acid. This is because the formal definition of a strong acid is one which completely disassociates when diluted in water, releasing large amounts of hydrogen ions. Indeed, the term pH, used to denote the strength of acids and bases, stands for potential of hydrogen. Because fluorine is so reactive, it holds tightly onto its hydrogen ion and disassociates only partially in water, technically making it a weak acid. The upshot of this rather confusing chemical terminology is that when it comes to acid, strong does not necessarily mean corrosive, since the corrosiveness of an acid depends not on its hydrogen, but of the other negatively charged ion. Indeed, the strongest acids known to science, the carborane superacids, are millions of times stronger than concentrated sulfuric acid, but will not attack organic tissue. And it turns out, well, neither will hydrofluoric acid. In the 10th episode of the 11th season of the Discovery Channel series Mythbusters, hosts Adam Savage and Jamie Heineman teamed up with Breaking Bad creator Vince Gilligan to investigate some of the show's chemical claims, including the feasibility of dissolving a body in hydrofluoric acid. To test this myth, the Mythbusters placed the carcass of a pig in an enamel cast iron bathtub, poured hydrofluoric acid all over it, and waited, and waited, and waited. Disappointingly, even after several hours, the pig carcass remained completely intact with not a hint of the chunky pink goo from the television series, nor did the enamel tub show any signs of erosion. At first glance, this seems strange, given the extreme reactiveness and corrosiveness of fluorine. However, fluorine is so reactive that when dissolved in water, it tends to bond strongly with other elements, greatly reducing its corrosive power and making it all but useless for disposing of bodies. Indeed, hydrofluoric acid is far more dangerous to the living than to the dead. Readily absorbed through the skin or through the lungs as a vapor, hydrofluoric acid produces several chemical burns that are initially painless and do not become apparent until a day or so after exposure. But as nasty as that is, it gets much worse. For once inside the body, hydrofluoric acid becomes an insidious poison, aggressively leaching calcium out of the bones and other tissues. Unfortunately, calcium just happens to be used by the body to signal muscle cells, including those of the heart, to contract. Thus, had Walt and Jesse accidentally absorbed a large enough dose of the acid through their skin or lungs, they would have likely died of cardiac arrest several hours later, and the whole series would have been considerably shorter. So, if not hydrofluoric acid, what then could Walt and Jesse have used to carry out their nefarious deed? Surprisingly, some of the most effective chemicals for dissolving organic tissue are conveniently some of the easiest to obtain, such as sulfuric acid, commonly found in car batteries. Sulfuric acid, or H2SO4, is, unlike HF, both a strong and highly corrosive acid. A powerful hydrolyzing agent, it aggressively dehydrates organic compounds such as carbohydrates and proteins, stripping them of their hydrogen and oxygen and leaving carbon behind. In one classic classroom demonstration, concentrated sulfuric acid is added to a beaker of ordinary white sugar, unleashing a violently exothermic reaction that releases hot steam and sulfur oxides that leave behind a spongy black mass composed of nearly pure carbon. Sulfuric acid is also better at dissolving the calcium apatite in animal bones and other chemicals. For these reasons, sulfuric acid has long been a favorite tool of murderers looking to make their victims disappear without a trace. One infamous case was that of George Alexander Serret, a French lawyer and con artist who in the 1920s carried out an elaborate insurance scheme with the help of two of his lovers, sisters Catherine and Philomene Schmidt. The scheme involved the sisters marrying unhealthy men on whom Serret would take out large life insurance policies. A third accomplice, Louis Chambon de Verger, would pose as the husbands and undergo the requisite medical examination for the insurance policies to be approved. The husbands would then be killed with poison, their ill health preventing a criminal investigation, and the spoils divided up among the conspirators. While the scheme worked, in 1925, Serret decided that Chambon de Verger was getting too greedy and murdered both him and his mistress, Noémie Ballandreau, dissolving their bodies in a vat of sulfuric acid to eliminate the evidence. The crime went unsolved for nearly 6 years, until 1931, when Catherine Schmidt was arrested for committing another insurance fraud and confessed to a previous crime. Serret was arrested, tried, convicted for murder, and sentenced to death, being executed by guillotine on April 10, 1934. And for more on the sordid history of this infamous execution device, please check out our video, The Last Guillotine Execution, in 1977, which is on our sister channel Highlight History. Though Serret was eventually caught and executed, the effectiveness of his chemical disappearing act would inspire another criminal across the English Channel. Born in 1909 in Stamford, Lincolnshire, John Hay began his criminal career in the mid-1930s by posing as a solicitor and selling fraudulent stock shares, purportedly from former deceased clients at below market rates. However, due to a spelling error on his letterhead, he was soon caught and sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud. Upon his release, Hay vowed to never again leave a victim alive to accuse him. In 1940, Hay ran into a former employer, William McSwan, in a pub, and he was introduced to McSwan's parents, Donald and Amy. William collected rent from several properties owned by his parents, and Hay soon grew envious of his wealth and lifestyle. So, on September 6, 1944, Hay lured William McSwan into a basement, hit him over the head with a lead pipe, and, inspired by the case of George Alexander Serret, dumped his body in a 45-gallon oil drum of concentrated sulfuric acid. The body took 2 days to dissolve, whereupon Hay poured what remained down a manhole. Hay then went to McSwan's parents and informed them that William was hiding out in Scotland in order to avoid military service. Over the following year, Hay took over the rent collection from William McSwan, but when the war ended, his parents began to wonder why their son had not returned. So, well, Hay decided to kill them as well. And so on July the 2nd, 1945, Hay lured Donald and Amy McSwan into a basement, clubbed them over the head, and dissolved their bodies in acid. He then stole their pension checks and sold their rental properties for £8,000 and moved into the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington. While Hay should have been set for life, he was also an inveterate gambler and soon found himself back in dire financial straits. So in 1947, he befriended the couple Archibald and Rose Henderson, and on February the 12th, lured them into a rented workshop, shot them dead, and I hope you're beginning to see the pattern here. He dissolved their bodies in sulfuric acid. He then forged a will with their signatures and sold their possessions for another £8,000. Hay's last victim was Olive Durant Deacon, the 69-year-old widow of a wealthy solicitor, John Durant Deacon, whom Hay befriended on the pretense of being an engineer interested in Olive's idea for artificial fingernails. On February the 18th, 1949, the same macabre dance repeated itself as Hay lured Durant Deacon to his workshop, shot her dead, and then dissolved her body in acid. This time, however, Hay would fall victim to his own haste, and his check had passed. 2 days after the murder, one of Durant Deacon's friends reported her missing. The police soon discovered Hay's long history of fraud and theft and searched the workshop, where they discovered a pile of incriminating evidence, including a dry cleaning receipt for Durant Deacon's Persian wool coat, which Hay had removed before dissolving her body. Even worse, unlike previous workshops Hay had rented for one of his nefarious deeds, the one used to kill and dissolve Olive Durant Deacon had no floor drain, so Hay simply dumped her liquefied remains over a rubble pile behind the property. An examination of the pile revealed 28 pounds of human body fat, part of a human foot, gallstones, and part of a denture that was eventually identified as belonging to Olive Durant Deacon. Hay, dubbed by the press as the acid bath murderer, was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder, meeting his fate at the end of a hangman's rope on August 10, 1949. In more recent years, the Sicilian mafia has become infamous for its Lupara Bianca, or white shotgun murders, in which victims mysteriously disappear without a trace. According to former hitman Filippo Marchesi, who worked under mafia boss Vincenzo Ciacane until his death in 1982, this is accomplished using concentrated sulfuric acid, which he claimed could completely liquefy a corpse in as little as 15 minutes. However, given the two previous examples that we've covered, this claim seems rather dubious, and in 2011, a group led by researcher Massimo Grillo at the University of Palermo set out to test the former mafioso's claims. Using pigs as an analog for humans, the team placed various cuts of tissue and bone in different concentrations of sulfuric acid and timed how long it took for them to dissolve. Unsurprisingly, this took far longer than Marchesi had claimed, on the order of 2 days with concentrated acid. By diluting the acid in water, the researchers were able to cut this time down to 12 hours for muscle and cartilage, but it still took 2 days for the bone to dissolve, and even then the process left behind large, fragile bone fragments with the consistency of shortbread, which still had to be pulverized by hand. Another team at the University of Milan obtained similar results, which led researcher Cristina Cataneo to conclude it is conceivable that a possible attempt to destroy an entire body is a thoroughly different task from destroying small samples. For a more effective means of destroying evidence, you're far better off moving to the other end of the pH scale and using a strong alkali, specifically sodium or potassium hydroxide, better known as lye. Lye is a powerful hydrolyzing agent with the added benefit that it is more effective than acids at breaking down the protein keratin that makes up hair and fingernails. Indeed, this is why it's commonly sold for clearing clogged drains. Furthermore, it is much easier to obtain lye in large quantities without arousing suspicion, for example, for making handmade soap, whereas strong acids are more heavily regulated since they can be used to manufacture explosives. Indeed, immersion in lye is the preferred body disposal method for the Mexican drug cartels, who rather darkly refer to the process as making pozole, a traditional Mexican meat stew, while highway departments, hospitals, and universities use lye-based digesters to dispose of roadkill, laboratory animals, human cadavers donated for medical research, and other biological waste. Heated to 100 degrees Celsius, the boiling point of water, a concentrated lye solution can dissolve a body in as little as 2 hours. Pressurizing the digester vessel allows the temperature to be raised even higher, further accelerating the process. In the end, all that remains is a light brown liquid composed mainly of water and amino acids, and a handful of crumbling bone fragments, both of which can be safely flushed down a regular drain. The efficiency of this process has led to its emergence as a green alternative to cremation for disposing of human corpses. Also known as aquamation, the process consumes only 1/8 of the energy and emits 1/10 the greenhouse gases as traditional cremation, with the added bonus of not emitting toxic heavy metals such as mercury from dental fillings into the environment. The bone fragments that remain can be pulverized in a machine called a cremulator, producing a fine white powder that can be placed in an urn, buried, or scattered in place of traditional ashes. First patented in 1888, aquamation was not offered commercially until the 1980s, and then only for disposing of pets. Only recently has it begun to gain traction with the human funeral industry, with Minnesota being the first U.S. state to legalize the process in 2003. 10 more states soon followed, the most recent being California in 2020. However, the funeral industry is very resistant to change, and 11 states have passed legislation banning aquamation outright. It remains to be seen whether the process will ever catch on or supplant burial and cremation as the dominant method of body disposal in the US. But while dissolution in lye is by far the easiest and most effective way of disposing of a body, it isn't that interesting to look at. But thankfully for murderers and mafiosos with a taste for the dramatic, there is a more exciting option: the piranha solution. Mainly used in analytical laboratories for cleaning traces of organic materials off glassware or silicon wafers, piranha solution is composed of concentrated hydrogen peroxide, or H2O2, mixed with sulfuric acid. As covered in our previous video, the German rocket fighter that dissolved its pilots alive, concentrated hydrogen peroxide, also known as high test peroxide, or HTP, is so reactive and corrosive it can strip flesh from bone in seconds. Mixing it with sulfuric acid combines the oxidation of the former with the hydrolyzation of the latter, producing a powerful 1-2 chemical punch. So effective is piranha solution at dissolving organic tissue that a piece of meat and bone lowered into it will disappear almost as soon as it hits the surface. This deadly efficiency was dramatically illustrated by the Mythbusters, who followed up their hydrofluoric acid test by immersing another pig carcass in piranha solution. This time the solution reacted immediately and violently, producing copious quantities of heat and steam and reducing the pig to a dark green oily soup within minutes. But while quick, efficient, and dramatic, piranha solution suffers from the same problem as sulfuric and other strong acids. The sale of ingredients is tightly regulated, creating a highly incriminating paper trail. Indeed, even in cases where a criminal managed to successfully make a body disappear, this paper trail is often enough to crack the investigation wide open. Take the case of American chemist Larissa Schuster, who in 2003, along with her lab assistant James Fagone, murdered her ex-husband Tim Schuster and dissolved his body in a barrel of hydrochloric acid. Police investigators quickly uncovered receipts for the purchase of the acid and the rental of a storage unit, a search which turned up a barrel containing Tim Schuster's remains. In 2008, Larissa Schuster was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In conclusion, for all its chemical verisimilitude, Breaking Bad was dead wrong about dissolving bodies. Not only is hydrofluoric acid possibly the worst choice for the job, but even the most corrosive chemicals like sulfuric acid and sodium hydroxide can take hours or even days to get the job done. And even then, they often leave readily identifiable fragments and an incriminating paper trail of suspicious purchases. The law is a funny thing, and when it comes to defamation and libel, it's notoriously murky. As such, writers often have to be careful when they're trying to create characters inspired by real people in order to avoid a lawsuit. For those who don't care about that, though, there's always the small penis rule. So, how do small penises get you out of such lawsuits? Well, in essence, all you have to do is describe the libelous character as having a penis of comically underwhelming size, the idea being that few men would be willing to sue if it meant having to stand up in court and say that the character in the novel who's seriously deficient in his nether regions is clearly based on them. This is an amazing defense. The earliest mention of the rule can be traced back to a 1998 New York Times article by Denisha Smith, though the description itself is attributed to libel lawyer Leon Friedman, who describes it as a sly trick used by writers looking to avoid a lawsuit for basing a character on someone who portrays them in a less than flattering manner by simply giving them a quality or attribute nobody would want. Yes, indeed, the undesirable trait does not have to be limited to one's manhood, and other techniques for avoiding claims of libel may involve things like giving the character an unsavory personal foible like foul body odor, describing the character as being ugly or overweight, making the character objectively abhorrent by describing them as racist or homophobic, going out of your way to make sure the audience knows the character is into some really kinky things in the bedroom. The idea behind all of these tactics is basically the same. By making the character have one or more traits that nobody would want to be associated with themselves, you can discourage whomever that character happens to be a pastiche of from taking the matter to court. That way, as long as you don't use the person's real name, you'll probably be fine. One minor example of this can be found in a CSI writer who included an almost transparent caricature caricature of two real estate agents he had met into an episode, making sure to make explicit reference to the fact that one of them was addicted to pornography and may have murdered his wife during particularly kinky sex. The names were changed in the final script used for the show, however, not so much in the draft for the script. A much more classic and rather extreme example of this occurred in Michael Crichton's book Next. In it, he describes a character called Mick Crowley, and just a heads up, the next bit is pretty disturbing. Alex Burnett was in the middle of the most difficult trial of her career, a rape case involving the sexual assault of a 2-year-old boy in Malibu. The defendant, 30-year-old Mick Crowley, was a Washington-based political columnist who was visiting his sister-in-law when he experienced an overwhelming urge to have anal sex with her young son still in diapers. Crowley was a wealthy, spoiled Yale graduate and heir to a pharmaceutical fortune. It turned out Crowley's taste in love objects was well known in Washington, but his lawyer, as was his custom, tried the case vigorously in the press months before the trial, repeatedly characterizing Alex and the child's mother as fantasizing feminist fundamentalists who had made up the whole thing from their sick, twisted imaginations. This despite a well-documented hospital examination of the child. Crowley's penis was small, but he had still caused significant tears to the toddler's rectum. This character, who is of virtually no importance to the overarching plot, is also called a dickhead later in the novel. It turns out Mick Crowley was a very thinly veiled stab at a journalist and Yale graduate called Michael Crowley, who had previously written a scathing review of Crichton. Perhaps the small penis rule worked in this case, as Crowley didn't sue. Instead, he wrote an article in which he stated, among other things, "I confess having mixed feelings about my sliver of literary immortality. It's impossible not to be grossed out on some level, particularly by the creepy image of the smouldering Crichton alone in his darkened study, imagining in pornographic detail the rape of a small child. It's uplifting, however, to learn that Next sales have proved disappointing by Crichton standards, continuing what an industrious newsletter dubs Crichton's recent pattern of erosion. And I'm looking forward to the choice Crichton will have to make when asked about the basis for Mick Crowley, between a comically dishonest denial and a confession of his shocking depravity." Crichton launched his noxious attack from behind the shield of the small penis rule because, I'm sure, he's embarrassed by what he has done. In researching my article, I found a man who has long yearned for intellectual stature beyond the realm of killer dinosaurs and talking monkeys, and Crichton must know that turning a critic into a poorly endowed child rapist won't exactly aid his cause. Ultimately, then, I find myself strangely flattered. To explain why, let me propose a corollary to the small penis rule. Call it the small man rule. If someone offers substantive criticism of an author, and the author responds by hitting below the belt, as it were, then he's conceding that the critic has won. And now for some bonus facts. Speaking of small penises, ever wonder if hand and foot size really correlate with penile length? Well, want to know more? It turns out that studies have consistently shown that the size of a guy's feet or the overall size of their hands is not related to their members' erect measurement. However, a man's fingers do give a strong clue as to their probable penis size, but the overall length of the fingers is not what's important here. Instead, as illustrated in a study published in the Asian Journal of Andrology in 2011, it's the ratio between the second and fourth digits on the hands that strongly correlates with the overall length of an individual's penis. Really? Seconds and This is so strange. As Dr. Ho Choi et al. States, univariate and multivariate analysis using linear regression models showed that only digit ratio was a significant predictive factor for stretched penile length. Stretched penile length. Okay. In a nutshell, the lower the ratio, how much shorter the index finger is than the ring finger, the longer the penis will probably be when erect. Okay. And if you're wondering here, studies show flaccid penis length is not an accurate predictor of erect penis length. More specifically, you can calculate your ratio by taking the length of your index finger, measured from the crease where it meets your hand to the tip, and divide it by the length of your ring finger. The shorter your index finger compared to the ring finger, the lower the ratio will be, and if you're a man, the longer your penis probably is. So why does the ratio of the index and ring finger lengths correlate to erect penis length? Is there possibly a reason for this? I guess there must be, but that's amazing. In the beginning, female and male genitals are pretty much the same. This is because they develop from the same cluster of tissues, gonads. In males, somewhere around week 7 to 9 of gestation, the gonads begin secreting two hormones: anti-Müllerian hormone, AMH, and testosterone. AMH prevents the development of the ducts that eventually turn into the fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the upper vagina. Once the gonads begin secreting testosterone, some of it, around 5 to 10%, gets transformed into another hormone called dihydrotestosterone, which we've discussed at length in our rather interesting video, Do Beards Really Grow Faster in the Winter, and Why Bald Men Grow Better Beards, which I'll link to below. But in short, with regards to the topic at hand, both testosterone and dihydrotestosterone will attach to androgen receptors, which affect the growth and development of many different body systems. Notable here, dihydrotestosterone attaches to androgen receptors on tissues that eventually develop and combine into the penis and scrotum. Low levels of this within the womb or later during puberty may result in an underdeveloped or malformed penis. So to sum up this part of things, penile growth in the womb is stimulated and affected by testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, and androgen receptors. Circulating amounts of the two hormones combined with the associated androgen receptor stimulation will determine penis size. So what about fingers? Circulating testosterone in the womb will affect other body parts as well, pertinent to the topic at hand, including the ratio between the second and fourth digits, index and ring fingers. So why does testosterone affect digits differently? For that, we have to get a little more technical, but essentially the activity mediated by androgen receptors and estrogen receptor A is higher in your ring finger compared to your index finger. This is regulated by the structure of genes controlling the process for the bone growth of your fingers called endochronal ossification. The spread of chondrocytes will determine the length of your finger, and this expansion is higher in the ring finger compared to the index finger. When you decrease the activation of androgen receptors during the narrow window of digit development, usually completed by week 13 of gestation, you will decrease the length of your ring finger. This activation is attributed to the amount of testosterone and DHT circulating throughout the tiny fetus. Conversely, if you decrease the activity of the receptor estrogen A, the one being stimulated more when you're female, you will get a longer ring finger. Based on this physiology, it has long been known that you can predict prenatal hormone exposure based on the ratio of these two fingers. Since both penile length and the ratio of the ring and index finger is basically a result of the amount of testosterone and DHT circulating in utero, there is a correlation between that ratio and the length of a man's favorite appendage. As you might have guessed from this, the ratio between the lengths of one's index finger and ring fingers is usually quite different in men and women. Men tend to have shorter index fingers than ring fingers. Women tend to have their index fingers either the same length or longer than their ring fingers. Oh yeah. Finally, penile length isn't the only thing digit ratio can predict. Since testosterone and DHT control the development of several body systems and processes, digit ratio can be a predictor of a wide range of physiological and psychological conditions. These include things like athletic ability, sexual orientation, fertility, and some sex-based ailments such as prostate and uterine problems. Lower digit ratios tend to occur in people with more aggressive behaviors, and those with them are less likely to suffer from eating disorders. People with higher digit ratios tend to be more agreeable. Research has also indicated that straight women and gay men who have higher ratios tend to prefer partners who are more masculine.
As shouldn't come as any surprise given the mortality rates of women giving birth throughout most of humans humaning, pregnancy prevention around the world has a lengthy history that includes many surprisingly effective but occasionally lethal methods of contraception. Early contraceptive options offered an array of colourful, creative, and in some cases incredibly gross choices that included innovative options in barrier devices, spermicides, and oral contraceptives. Beyond these devices and substances, one of the oldest known methods still in use and relatively popular today was coitus interruptus, aka pull and pray or withdrawal, with the earliest documented use of this being found in the Bible and a story estimated to have been written about 2,500 years ago. This was the tale of Onan, who was supposed to be getting his brother's widow Tamar pregnant to provide an heir for his deceased sibling. Instead, he simply had sex with her and withdrew, spilling his seed on the ground to make sure she wouldn't get pregnant. Fascinatingly, despite this story pretty explicitly being about Onan not doing his duty to get his brother's widow pregnant to continue his brother's life, line. This oddly, in some circles, became more about saying that masturbation, or otherwise, in the general case, spilling your seed outside of a lady's naughty bits, was sinful, and thus any method of contraception was also sinful. Despite the pull and pray method's bad reputation, it turns out as long as you get the pull part right, there really isn't much praying necessary. Among other studies, research done in 2008 at the Guttmacher Institute in New York demonstrated the withdrawal method, when executed perfectly, is 96% effective for preventing pregnancy after a year of romping sample size. This basically means that over the course of a year, 4 out of 100 women who use this method as their primary form of birth control will become pregnant in that year. For comparison, using a condom when done perfectly over that same span is 98% effective, and oral contraception has a perfect use rate of 99.7% effectiveness. And now, this is when all 3 methods are done perfectly. So what about in actual practice with everyday people? The pull and pray method is roughly 82% effective over the course of a year's usage, while using a condom is roughly 83% effective, so you are only getting a 1% improvement for your money over just raw dogging it. The pill, in contrast, does offer a much better real-world use rate of about 96%, and of course, the pull method puts an awful lot of trust in the guy to do his job there. Nevertheless, for trusting partners and where STIs aren't really a concern, it turns out historically, when talking preventing pregnancy, people have always had something basically as good as condoms at their disposal. And as demonstrated by the story of Onan, humans have long been well aware of this fact. And, of course, performing the withdrawal method perfectly isn't too complex, the withdrawal part being obvious and simply a matter of doing it. That said, there is one way you can still get this part right and mess up. While you might be thinking pre-cum would be the culprit, it turns out studies show pre-cum does not typically contain viable sperm outside of the case of the real problem, residual sperm in the male's urethra from a previous but very recent sexual encounter. This problem can be gotten around simply by the man urinating between sexual encounters, not too complex a thing to get right either. Given its simplicity, it's perhaps unsurprising that previous to the Roman Empire, evidence suggests that the withdrawal method was one of the primary forms of contraception used. This fell out of popularity with the Romans, who seem to have favored other methods available at the time, most of which have been lost to history, but from anecdotal evidence, many of them seem to have been quite effective themselves. One that is known is that they use Queen Anne's lace, which is still occasionally used as a form of contraception in some parts of the world, such as India, and has been shown to have anti-fertility properties. After the fall of the Roman Empire, most methods of contraception fell out of practice in the Western world, at least in terms of what was written down, partially from the influence of Christianity, as birth control historically was seen as sinful within the church, going back to the story of Onan and all, and perhaps also simply because the knowledge of many of the effective methods was lost. It is generally thought people still popularly used the pull method, even if it wasn't discussed in polite conversation or recorded, and other methods were likewise probably used, even if not written about much. Around the early 19th century, however, documented history shows the pull method saw a huge surge in popularity among societies the world over, and was one of the leading forms of contraception until methods such as the modern condom and the pill were introduced. Today, around 2.5% of the world's population still uses the withdrawal method as the primary method of birth control, and an estimated 52% of people have used it at least once as an intentional method of birth control, rather than just withdrawing for, the other spicy reasons. And speaking of the modern condom, another contraception method that isn't as new as many people think is, well, the condom. Although early versions of the condom didn't always cover the entire penis, and of course, they certainly weren't made of latex. For example, the first known reference to someone using a condom goes all the way back to about 5,000 years ago to King Minos of Knossos, whose sperm was apparently full of scorpions and serpents. Scorpion sperm was, as you might expect, a problem for delicate ladybirds and resulted in the death of many lovers. The accuracy of his deadly sperm aside, what is more interesting to the story at hand was that to get around the issue, he began using a bladder of a goat as a condom. Also interesting here is that it also appears that even in these earliest references, humans were cognizant of such a condom's disease-spreading preventative attributes. Moving over to our Eastern brethren, lovemaking in Asia often relied on devices called glans condoms, which addressed only the head of the penis. Animal parts were a popular choice for making these condoms. The Chinese fashioned theirs out of lamb intestines, while the Japanese used tortoise shell, called kabutoga, or animal horn, throughout the 1870s. Yes, literally getting horny when horny to prevent the fetal parasite. Right, now going back to the animal bits, animal offal is the internal organs and entrails of butchered animals, and not the first thing that comes to mind concerning birth control. But to the Europeans living during the mid-1700s, these organ meats were transformed into their way of preventing babies. Slaughterhouse workers would style early condoms out of sausage skins. Interestingly, Julius Schmidt, the creator of the now infamous Sheik and Ramses brand of condoms, was once a sausage maker who made lamb gut condoms in the 1880s. Yes, wrapping your tool in lamb gut once was the height of birth control technology, and don't even get us started on Pliny the Elder suggesting that to ease the pain and other issues surrounding giving birth, the woman should drink goose jizz mixed with a little water, or honeyed wine mixed with literal cow crap, and say it with me, the past was the worst. Glans condoms were also made out of fabric. There are ancient accounts suggesting early Egyptians living around 1000 BC used linen sheaths during intercourse to protect against disease. In the 16th century, the Europeans also soaked linen sheaths in a chemical solution that was laid out to dry before use. Pieces of the cloth were measured to cover the glands of the penis and are later held in place with ribbon. Going back to the 18th century, Gabriele Falloppio, the Italian who prominently described what would become known as the fallopian tube after his namesake, noted these linen sheaths were particularly effective not just at preventing pregnancy but also the spread of diseases such as syphilis, including studying 1,100 men who used such devices and their apparent immunity from contracting syphilis when they did so. Of course, a downside of the linen variety of condom was that they were noted as being much less comfortable than the animal intestine varieties. Perhaps not coincidentally, around this time, as the rise of these types of sheaths became more popular, fertility rates in places they became popular also dropped. It's also known that brothels around this time in Europe began selling such devices for use before partaking in their workers' wares to help protect from disease and pregnancy. Fast forward to one of the crowning achievements of the industrialized world, Charles Goodyear's vulcanization of rubber in 1839 would eventually lead to the creation of the first rubber condom in 1844. Strips of raw rubber were wrapped around penis-shaped molds, which were later dipped in a chemical solution to cure the rubber. With a shelf life of a few months and being very durable, men could actually reuse these particular condoms. In 1912, a new and improved way to manufacture condoms emerged, adding gasoline or benzene to the rubber to liquefy it. The latex condom was officially invented in 1920, and the consumers loved the stronger, thinner material with a shelf life of 5 years. This was all well timed, as just previous to this, soldiers in World War I weren't just dropping like flies from battle, but from their leisure stress reduction activities, bumping uglies with local ladies, and the widespread and rather rampant disease spreading that happened as a result. This is something the invention of the latex condom helped curtail significantly by World War II among soldiers. Inexpensive, easy to use, and effective at preventing the spread of certain diseases, something the withdrawal method doesn't help with much, condoms are now one of the most popular forms of contraception. However, despite the availability of some version of the male condom throughout much of history and the ease and freeness of the withdrawal method, people still chose to find other methods for preventing pregnancy, some of which were not just bizarre but were downright dangerous. Since women were historically viewed as playing a more significant role in getting pregnant, the number of available options for female birth control was much greater and displayed a much higher level of inventiveness. For example, early topical and suppository contraceptives have included olive oil, pomegranate pulp, ginger, and even tobacco juice, which women would smear on and or inside their vagina as an early spermicide. According to the oldest recorded information regarding birth control, a document that's nearly 4,000 years old, the Egyptian Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, which also happened to be the first known medical text, women used pessaries made out of, we kid you not, crocodile dung and honey as a form of contraception. In hindsight, it was pretty smart to combine animal feces with a very effective antibacterial substance like honey, and indeed it's also thought certain Native American tribes used honey for this same contraceptive purpose, a literal honeypot. Noteworthy is that honey isn't just antibacterial, but also does this via the production of hydrogen peroxide when encountering moisture, which no doubt all helped as well as a mild spermicide. Going back to the Egyptians, in addition to physically preventing sperm from fertilizing an egg, the acidic properties of the dung may have served as an effective spermicide. In India, elephant dung has been used in the same manner, because, well, who doesn't want to shove poop up your naughty bits and then go to town on said bits? Another method the text describes on top of the crocodile dung was the use of acacia gum, which is much less mentally repulsive to put in one's hoo-ha and indeed does work as a spermicide. It can even be found in some spermicide products today, like crocodile dung. Fast forward a few thousand years, and in 1832, Dr. Dr. Charles Knowlton popularized the method of syringe douching as a method of contraception, and throughout the US, women would use his douching mixtures comprised of vinegar, zinc sulfide, and liquid chloride to prevent pregnancy. It wasn't until after 1850 that hard rubber syringes came into play. Before that, early syringes were made out of horn, bone, or pewter. Douching kits and solutions were sold during the greater part of the 1900s. At one time, American women painfully turned to the popular household disinfectant Lysol as a method of contraception. From the 1930s through the 1960s, the Lysol disinfectant douche was a top seller in feminine hygiene products. However, not only did the Lysol douche later prove ineffective as a spermicide, but its use also led to toxic effects such as inflammation, irritation, and burning sensations of the vagina and cervix. Getting away from Lysol, the first commercially produced birth control pill called Endovid-10 made an appearance on the market in 1960, just before the FDA approved the use of synthetic progesterone and estrogen in pill form that works to prevent ovulation in women. The market offered female pills with oftentimes unidentified ingredients or questionable herbal concoctions used to induce or speed up menstrual flow as a way to provoke a miscarriage. As for the first use of intrauterine devices, this dates back to the Middle Ages when Arab Bedouins would insert pebbles into the uteruses of their camels to prevent pregnancy during long desert journeys. The pebbles caused a mild infection in the uterus that affected the fertilization and implantation of eggs. As for humans, it wasn't until the 1960s in the US that the IUD was an acceptable form of birth control for women. Over time, IUDs have been made out of suture materials, coiled metal wire, stainless steel, plastic, rubber, copper wire, and silver filaments, all proving extremely effective at their quasi-goalkeeping abilities. Going back a bit with substances, in the mid-19th century, preparations of loose herbs such as pennyroyal, rue, hellebore, mistletoe, foxglove, Queen Anne's lace, blue root, ergot, and different mint plants were steeped in hot water like a cup of tea or dissolved in alcohol before consumption. While herbs such as tansy and pennyroyal may have had a reputation for possessing abortive properties, they also worked by poisoning the women. Going back much further with the liquid birth control concoctions, it was also an unfortunate habit of early physicians to use chemical-laden drinks that blended lethal substances like arsenic, mercury, and strychnine with grains, fruits, and oils. Early physicians would suggest women drink the poisonous mixtures as a way to disrupt their reproductive systems, usually in very controlled dosages so as to prevent pregnancy without killing the woman, often though inducing a miscarriage if a fertilized egg is present. For instance, Soranus, a Greek gynecologist practicing during the 2nd century AD, told women to drink the water the blacksmith used to cool metal as a birth control method. About 500 years before this, Hippocrates recommended copper ore be used as an effective birth control method, demonstrating that even the ancients had made the connection between copper and contraception, something that the aforementioned modern IUDs rely on. In 900 BC, Chinese birth control experts advised women to swallow 16 tadpoles fried in quicksilver, mercury, immediately after sex. Successful results that came from drinking toxic remedies sometimes came with damage to the liver, kidneys, and other major organs. Some women would never again have children in the future, becoming sterile, or worse, they would die. In both cases, we guess the methods were indeed super effective at preventing unwanted childbirth. Although, don't get us started on the curious phenomenon of coffin births, but okay, we'll talk about it a bit in the bonus facts. Not every oral or liquid contraceptive method was deadly, although perhaps the effectiveness is questionable. Acidic fruits and vegetables often played a role in early birth control. To prevent a pregnancy, Arabian women would eat mashed pomegranates mixed with rock salt and alum. During the 1400s, drinking raw onion juice was a trick of the Italians. In 1600, the French ate cabbage after intercourse. Not so sure about the effectiveness there, maybe a connection made via listeria and its abortive properties. Whatever the case, it was certainly a thing. On the other side, one of the most effective and safe liquid remedies for birth control was most likely lemon juice as a topical remedy. Specifically, to create a physical barrier in the vagina, women would insert soft wool soaked in vinegar or lemon juice to prevent pregnancy, and serves as an example of an early form of the cervical cap with a form of spermicide naturally baked in. Another seemingly very effective birth control method used by the ancient Greeks and Romans was the Silphium plant, which is now unfortunately extinct, and became so because of its extreme popularity for medicinal purposes, mainly for birth control. Why it became extinct when it was more valuable than silver was because of failure after failure to try and grow it away from its natural habitat of a small stretch of land in what is now Libya. Because of the small area it could be grown successfully and the extreme demand, by the 2nd century BC, the plant went the way of the dodo, ironically losing its evolutionary reproductive battle because of its supposed ability to stop reproduction in another living thing. As to how it was used is not fully understood, but it appears its leaves were ground up and drunk in some sort of way, with evidence pointing to its abortive effects. In the end, we've come a long way from the near 4,000-year-old method of crocodile dung and honey, and even the more modern method of Lysol douching. But it's surprising to see that so many ancient methods for birth control seem to have been remarkably effective, and some, such as the basic withdrawal method, are still chugging along today as an effective means of birth control. So, if we take anything from this, it's that apparently, from the beginning of humans humaning, we've been trying to have our cake and eat it too in regards to sex and preventing our human fetal parasites. Bonus facts. When you die, your body is, in a quite real sense, never more alive. Beyond the amazing number of microbes that already call your body home, now thriving to a level your immune system was previously preventing, more of their cells than your own at any given time, by the way, other bacteria and varying fungi and fauna colonize the body with great rapidity after death. As the body becomes biome, flesh undergoes a dreadful pantomime of balloon animal elasticity, swelling, bloating, distorting. This dance macabre is quite likely not what one has in mind when one hears of life after death. However, these commonplace morbidities of life and death pale in comparison to one of the more unusual and completely tragic graveyard phenomena: post-mortem fetal extrusion, aka coffin birth, where the dead mother gives birth after the fact to an equally dead baby. Historical texts bear this gruesome curiosity out with a clinical chill. In 1551, one of the earliest known documented cases of coffin birth was recorded. A victim of the Spanish Inquisition, swinging at the gallows, gave birth hours after her execution. In 1633, a Brussels woman who died in labor convulsions gave post-mortem birth 3 days later. In 1650, a parish register noted, April the 20th, 1650, was buried M, the wife of Thomas Toplace, who was found delivered of a child after she had lain 2 hours in the grave. In 1677, another woman died in labor. 6 hours later, abdominal movements were observed, and still 18 hours after that, her deceased child was born. In 1861, 60 hours after a woman died in convulsions, she gave birth to her 8-month-old baby. The idea of post-mortem birth has been recognized as both a mythological notion and a medical possibility for centuries. Indeed, the Greek god of medicine, Asclepius, was cut from his mother's womb after she was killed upon Mount Olympus. The earthly heirs of Asclepius, medical professionals of yore, made common practice of opening the bodies of dead pregnant women, aware that live birth was still possible if they were fast enough. Indeed, the Catholic Church, intent upon delivering children from the purgatory of death before baptism, supported this as church doctrine. Priests were called upon to perform the post-mortem caesarean on pain of excommunication. At times, some physicians didn't even bother to wait for the mother to die if it seemed absolutely certain that she would do so anyway, further helping to ensure the survival of the child. But this is the morbid tale of when the baby is not cut out. So what happens then? Well, dead bodies decompose. This process involves the diminution of oxygen, which in turn is accompanied by the multiplication of anaerobic bacteria, which leads to a buildup of gases like carbon dioxide and methane created on breakdown of the body. The gases cause the body to swell up significantly. It is those gases which perform a similar role to the contractions that a woman experiences during normal childbirth. The increased volume of gases in the deceased pushes on the uterus, forcing the dead fetus through the vagina and occasionally also forcing the uterus itself to prolapse out. Thus, through the decomposition of the dead, a gruesome birth is simulated, hence the term coffin birth. Given that all it potentially takes for a coffin birth to happen is the death of a pregnant woman where saving the baby isn't attempted, well, why don't we hear about these coffin births today? Not beyond cremations, this is primarily due to the ubiquity of embalming the dead. Chemicals used to preserve the body and make it presentable slow down decomposition and flush the normal bodily fluids and a significant number of microbes away. The result is removal of many of the elements that are so instrumental to coffin births, making them an extremely rare occurrence in modern times. Rare, however, is not never, and documented coffin births do still occasionally happen. To end on a slightly less morbid note, and here we'll emphasize slightly, not all post-mortem deliveries result in the death of the baby, though these are then technically not classified as post-mortem fetal extrusion. Such was the case of a 23-year-old woman in India in 2007. After contractions started, she killed herself, but her body ultimately completed the birth of the infant naturally.